You wake to the soft memory of a medieval town, such as Winchester, not as the grand place that fills heroic tales, but as a living landscape of ordinary concerns. Cobblestones worn by countless bare feet, thin alleys lined with timber houses that lean inward with age, early morning smoke, curling from ovens, where bakers begin their slow work. The air clings with the scent of damp wool, stale grain, and the faint sweetness carried from nearby orchards. This was the setting of daily life, a place in which most people lived quietly, without any expectation of being remembered. Yet even in such calm surroundings, there existed figures who threaded themselves through the small crevices of society, shaping the town through acts so unassuming that most never noticed them. One such figure was a thief remembered only in scattered references, minor legal notes, and the oral remnants of a few chroniclers. The records never provide a full name, only the title used by constables of the time, who called him the Quiet Thief. You may imagine him not as the bold criminal of later legends, but as an individual who moved with deliberate care, as if he were simply part of the background. During this period, Winchester served as both a religious center and a steady marketplace, which meant many souls passed through its gates each day. Merchants from nearby towns came bearing salted fish, simple pottery, dyed cloth, and whatever else gave them a few coins to take home. Farmers arrived with carts of barley, wheat, or vegetables, materials that would feed the growing number of households. Pilgrims also came, exhausting their savings for the chance to visit ancient relics. Each person carried belongings worth protecting, and each person was distracted enough at times to be vulnerable. Most thieves of this period worked in pairs or groups, relying on distraction and quick movement. But the Quiet Thief did not favor such methods. Accounts suggest he moved alone, preferring the quieter corners where he would spend entire evenings simply observing. He studied patterns in the market flow, noting which merchants left their stalls unattended during evening prayer, which tavern workers placed their keys under loose stones, and which households forgot to secure their storage sheds. Theft in this time was not simply the grabbing of another person's goods. It was a slow process of learning how the town breathed. The town watch consisted mostly of part-time volunteers, who held no formal training. They were tired men, sometimes older than they wished to admit, who patrolled with wooden staves and lanterns. Their attention wandered, and their responsibilities stretched beyond their ability. They had little interest in combing dark alleys, unless paid to do so. This created a landscape where a thief could thrive, not because he was extraordinary, but because the world around him held so many blind spots. You can imagine the Quiet Thief walking the lanes just after dusk, when the last of the daylight clung to the rooftops, and the lamps had not yet been lit. He would blend among townsfolk returning from the fields or the marketplace. In those moments, the sounds of clattering shutters and murmured conversations became a kind of shelter. Those who later described him mentioned nothing remarkable. Some said he wore a cloak of cheap wool, the kind many wore. Others believed he carried a narrow sack hidden beneath his clothing. A few suggested he walked with a slight stoop, though this detail may have been invented to make him seem easier to spot. Theft was seldom glamorous in medieval towns. The items stolen were small, often barely valuable: a length of coarse linen, a pouch of barley, a single candle, or a bit of beeswax. Objects that, in some cases, were taken not for sale but for survival. This era offered little security for anyone without a trade or a stable household. A person without land struggled to find work. A person without guild membership earned only what others granted. Hunger shaped many crimes, especially during poor harvests. There are indications that the Quiet Thief had once been a laborer. A few surviving references mention that he seemed to know the habits of stable workers, coopers, and tanners, which suggests he moved among such trades at some point. Those who lose steady work in such roles often slide toward the edges of society, not out of malice, but due to the slow erosion of options. In this sense, the Quiet Thief may not have begun as a criminal. Instead, he may have been someone pushed aside by shifting patterns in work and community. When you think about medieval theft, you may picture dramatic chases or swift punishments. In reality, most crimes went unnoticed. People often did not report stolen goods unless the loss was severe. Record writing was slow and expensive. Constables wrote entries only when an accusation was formal enough to require it. Many thefts were settled privately, or not at all. The Quiet Thief operated within this murky space, where only fragments of his acts reached official parchment. One of the earliest surviving notes concerning him describes the disappearance of a small iron tool from a thatcher. The note mentioned that a man fitting the thief's vague description had been seen lingering near the workshop, but the thatcher did not press charges, as the tool was quickly replaced. A later entry described the taking of a sack of oats from a cart that had been left unwatched. Again, no one pursued the matter deeply. Goods could vanish for countless reasons. Someone might have misplaced them, a hungry traveler may have borrowed them, animals might have dragged them away. Only when repeated patterns appeared did the constables begin to suspect a consistent hand behind these small vanishings. Over time, whispers grew. Some residents claimed that this thief never broke a lock, never damaged a door, and never forced his way inside a house. Instead, he waited for doors left ajar, or for windows forgotten during warm nights. There was a saying recorded by a later chronicler, who heard it from childhood memory. It stated that the thief did not steal by strength but by silence. It is impossible to verify whether this saying truly circulated at the time, but it captures the way later generations framed the figure. It is easy to overlook how fragile livelihoods were in Winchester during this period. A household often relied on a single season of good harvest to carry them through the rest of the year. A missing bundle of barley could mean a month of thinner meals. A stolen candle meant more hours spent in darkness. Even a small theft carried weight. The quiet thief's impact might appear trivial to modern eyes. Yet to those who lost a handful of goods, his presence would have been deeply unsettling. In this sense, crime in such towns was measured less by the value of the item and more by the disruption of daily rhythm. Yet, what remains strange in the surviving notes is the tone used when referencing the thief. None of the entries portray him as violent. None suggest he carried weapons. He never harmed animals or damaged property. Even when cornered once by two watchmen, he escaped not by fighting but by slipping through a narrow passage where they could not follow. This has led some historians to speculate that he moved through the town as if he valued not being seen more than acquiring goods. Another curiosity lies in his choice of stolen items. He never aimed for objects of great worth, which would have drawn swift attention. Instead, he seemed to prefer goods so ordinary that their absence was almost unremarkable. Some scholars argue that this selective pattern shows a keen understanding of the town's psychology. He knew where he could take without stirring an alarm. You may wonder how such a thief could maintain a life built entirely on such small acquisitions. Some historians believe he may have traded stolen goods with travelers outside the walls. Others think he consumed most of what he took. There is even a suggestion that he stored items in abandoned sheds near the outskirts, though no hard evidence survives. What is known is that his presence lingered for several years, long enough for his title to root itself in the town's memory. As you reflect on this quiet figure, you may begin to think of medieval crime not as a dramatic tale, but as a subtle thread woven into the daily routines of ordinary people. Each stolen item hints at a life lived on the margins, shaped by hunger, necessity, or perhaps a personal sense of detachment from the social bonds of the town. Yet one question puzzles modern readers. If he remained so careful, so subtle, then what event eventually revealed him more clearly to the town authorities? What moment broke the pattern of quiet vanishings and shifted their attention fully upon him? You return to the streets of Winchester with a sense of slowed time, as if the lanes themselves move at their own pace, unhurried and rooted in a world where days changed gently. The town had grown accustomed to the subtle losses that marked the quiet thief's presence. People complained, then carried on. Households replaced what they could. Merchants tightened the reins on their carts. Bakers began locking their oven rooms. But these were mild adjustments, the sort of everyday corrections that medieval life demanded as part of its natural rhythm. It was only when a single incident shifted from nuisance to disruption that the town watch directed their focus toward him. The event remembered, in the records, involved a small parish house near the southern edge of the town. This house served both as a residence for a local priest and as a place where alms were stored for the poor. The parish gathered leftover grain, crusts of bread, cloth scraps, and occasionally small coins offered by wealthier families seeking blessings. Nothing stored there held great monetary value, yet it held deep significance for the community. These goods were lifelines for widows, orphans, and travelers who needed help. Because of that, the theft that occurred one quiet night was viewed with greater seriousness than all the earlier vanishings combined. The records describe how the parish priest, a man believed to have been in his late 40s, discovered the loss at dawn. A basket of leftover bread was missing, along with several small bags of barley meant to support new mothers recovering from childbirth. A few scraps of wool cloth were gone as well, though these were of little value. What concerned the priest the most was not the worth of these items, but the idea that someone had intruded upon a place meant to provide comfort. The boundary between public need and private desperation had been crossed. The priest walked to the town centre and reported the theft formally. His statement was brief, steady, and without exaggeration. The constables wrote it in their ledgers with slow strokes of quill and ink, noting the goods taken and the hour they were discovered missing. For the first time, the quiet thief's pattern aligned clearly with a location associated with charity. This distinction turned a string of petty crimes into something viewed as potentially harmful to the fabric of the town. From that moment, the constables increased their patrols during the late hours. They assigned 2 watchmen to remain near the parish house each night. They also questioned a few townsfolk who had previously mentioned seeing a shadowy figure near granaries or workshops. These accounts were vague, but the constables began to assemble a rough sense of who they sought. A man who moved alone, who avoided direct confrontation, who stole useful but unremarkable goods, and who seemed to know the habits of workers and households. A person who behaved like a ghost drifting between needs. Still, nothing more concrete surfaced. The town was filled with poor labourers, travellers, and seasonal workers. Many fit the general description. People dressed in the same coarse clothing, walked with tired gaits, and kept their heads low. The quiet thief could have been any one of them, which was part of why he had survived unnoticed for so long. During this period, Winchester experienced a shift in its economic life. Grain prices fluctuated due to weather patterns in nearby farmlands. A wet season earlier in the year had led to concerns about spoilage. Some merchants began to guard their goods more closely. As a result, the townsfolk reacted sharply to any form of theft. Even the smallest disappearance now felt heavier, as though it were pulling threads from an already strained fabric. When people felt the world becoming less stable, they looked more intently for explanations, and when explanations appeared vague, they blamed the one shadow already known to them. The constables, responding to this unease, placed more effort into tracking him. They chose a few individuals suspected of vagrancy and questioned them harshly, though none admitted to involvement. Some of these men likely had never heard of the quiet thief. Others may have known of him, but only as a whisper. Medieval justice often functioned by assumption, and those caught on suspicion could only hope to prove their innocence. But in this case, each man questioned was eventually released, for no stolen goods were found in their possession, nor any convincing evidence presented against them. Yet the constables did manage to uncover something of interest. Near a cluster of abandoned sheds by the town's outer fields, one watchman claimed to have found remnants of goods matching the descriptions of earlier thefts. A few barley kernels scattered on the ground. A piece of cloth torn in a way that matched a merchant's earlier report. A single candle stub, partly melted. The watchman believed he had found the thief's hiding place, though it remained uncertain whether these traces were truly his or simply the leftovers of many years of neglect. The sheds had seen countless uses by farmers, travelers, and children playing at adventure. Still, the discovery fed the town's imagination and narrowed the focus of their suspicions. At this point, the quiet thief could no longer rely on anonymity alone. People began to glance behind them while walking the lanes. Shopkeepers kept doors shut until the last possible moment. Lanterns stayed lit longer into the night, their warm glow pushing back the shadows he once slipped through with ease. And though he remained free, his world grew smaller. He could no longer linger near the market undisturbed. He could not observe the flow of goods with the same patience. The town had awakened to him, and in doing so, had changed the very environment that allowed him to survive quietly. Some chroniclers from later centuries describe him as a man of habit, someone who moved according to long-watched patterns. If this is true, then the tightening of attention around him must have made his life far more precarious. Habit offers comfort, but also creates vulnerability. When the familiar path suddenly narrows, a person must either adjust or risk being trapped. How much the quiet thief understood this shift is unknown, but the next event recorded in the ledgers suggests that he either failed to adapt or believed he could maintain his routine without consequence. The event took place on a late autumn evening. The harvest had recently ended, and villagers were preparing for the colder months ahead. Workers moved through the streets carrying sacks of dried vegetables and winter firewood. The air smelled of damp earth and smoke. A merchant who specialized in selling tallow candles had closed his stall early and returned to his small workshop. He set a bundle of simple candles near an open window to cool. These candles were nothing extravagant, but they represented hours of labor. Their disappearance, therefore, was noticed immediately. The merchant claimed he stepped inside for only a few breaths of time. When he returned, the bundle was gone. A neighbor mentioned seeing a thin figure pass nearby, though she could not describe more detail. The constables recorded this theft with more urgency. This was the second time in a short span that someone had taken goods important to community preparation for winter. The watchman now believed the quiet thief had become careless or emboldened. In response, the constables created a schedule of rotating patrols. They began walking overlapping routes, a rare effort for a town accustomed to loosely organized lawkeeping. The presence of moving lantern lights became a nightly rhythm, casting shifting patterns along the cobblestones. This made the town safer in some ways, but far less predictable for someone who relied on those shadows for shelter. You may imagine the quiet thief on these nights, watching from the edges as lantern light swept across doorways and along the ground. His world was filled with uncertainty. Every quiet corner he once trusted now held the risk of surprise. But necessity can be stronger than caution. Hunger still weighed on him. The need for warmth during the approaching winter pressed against him. Those who lived at the margins rarely had the luxury of pausing their efforts, even when danger grew. The final incident that brought the constables close to identifying him occurred not during a theft, but during a moment of attempted escape. Late one night, a watchman posted near the parish house heard faint movement behind a shed. He raised his lantern and stepped forward, calling out. The light revealed the outline of a man crouched near a stack of stored goods. The man froze for an instant before bolting through the gap between two buildings. The watchman gave chase, shouting for assistance. Two others joined him, and for the first time, the quiet thief found himself pursued directly. The chase wound through narrow alleys where the lantern light flickered against uneven walls. The thief kept ahead of the watchman, but only barely. He slipped once on damp stones, regaining his balance with effort. The pursuit continued until they reached a passage so narrow that the watchman could not follow. The constables stopped there, frustrated, panting, and aware that they had come closer than ever before. Though the thief escaped, the watchmen now believed they had a sense of his size, his movement, and perhaps even the texture of the cloak he wore. They wrote down these details in their records. The description remained vague, but it was more substantial than any earlier notes. The town settled into restless anticipation. People wondered when he might strike again. Some believed he had been frightened enough to leave. Others thought hunger would drive him back. Nights passed with no new thefts, and the constables debated whether to continue their heightened patrols or allow the town to return to its slower rhythm. But what truly happened to the quiet thief during this stretch of silence? And what decision would he make as winter settled more firmly across Winchester, bringing with it both hardship and opportunity? You return once more to the quiet world of Winchester, as winter begins to settle over the town. The first mornings of frost appear lightly on the thatched roofs, clinging in pale crystals that melt as soon as the sun rises. Smoke drifts from hearths earlier in the day now, and townsfolk walk more quickly through the lanes, clutching their cloaks around their bodies. The rhythm of daily life slows, shaped by the cold, and you can sense how the narrowing season presses upon both the well-fed and the hungry. In this environment, the absence of the quiet thief becomes as noticeable as his earlier presence. Days pass, then weeks, and no new thefts are reported. Bakers keep their storerooms untouched. Merchants find their goods exactly where they left them. The parish stores remain full, ready for the poor who rely on them. The constables begin to relax, loosening their patrol schedule, shortening their routes. Lanterns that once swayed through the streets, deep into the night, are now extinguished earlier, returning the town to its natural darkness. And yet, beneath the calm exterior, questions remain. Did the thief leave the town entirely, slipping away along the southern road or into the wooded edges beyond? Did he fall ill, or meet misfortune somewhere unseen? Or was he simply waiting, watching the changing patterns, learning once again how to move silently within a world that had briefly awakened to him? People ignored these questions during the bustle of the daylight hours, but they lingered in discussion as families gathered around hearths in the evenings. You can picture the thief himself, wherever he hid during this long pause. In medieval life, the boundary between surviving and starving was perilously thin, especially for those without land or trade. Winter brought fewer opportunities for odd jobs, fewer open stalls from which to earn a coin, and far fewer chances to blend unnoticed among crowds. Hunger came quickly for those who lived on the margins. If the quiet thief was still in Winchester, he was likely feeling the unrelenting press of necessity. Some later chroniclers suggest that he may have attempted to reintegrate among workers in the outer fields, offering his labor in exchange for food. If this is true, it would explain the temporary quiet in town. Hiring hands for winter tasks was common, though such work was often meager and inconsistent. The quiet thief may have found brief opportunities, cutting firewood, mending simple tools, or tending to livestock in return for a few meals. But these accounts remain only conjecture, built from a mixture of local stories and the limited evidence available. What the records do confirm is that the silence eventually broke. A new entry appeared in the constable's ledger late in the season, describing a theft so different from the earlier pattern that it stands out even centuries later. It involved not a household, nor a merchant stall, nor the parish stores. Instead, it concerned a granary owned cooperatively by several small farmers just outside the western gate. This granary stored the grain that would feed their families and animals through the cold months. It was protected carefully, for a single night of loss could jeopardize weeks of winter sustenance. The entry described a breach in the granary wall. It was not broken by force but by the removal of a few wooden planks that had grown loose over the years. The opening was small, just enough for a single person to slip through. Several sacks of barley were missing, along with a handful of dried beans. What made this incident unusual was the scale. The quiet thief had never taken so much before. These were not small items that could be hidden easily within clothing. They required deliberate effort and more time than he had ever risked. The farmers who owned the granary were furious. They marched into Winchester to demand immediate action from the constables. They argued that this was no longer a matter of petty theft, but a threat to their survival. The constables recorded the complaint and agreed to treat the incident with the utmost seriousness. They believed, based on earlier clues, that the quiet thief had acted out of growing desperation. The winter had likely stripped him of alternatives. In the eyes of the authorities, this was an escalation that could not be ignored. In the days following the theft, the constables searched the outskirts more carefully. They examined abandoned sheds and barns, places where someone without shelter might hide. They questioned travelers passing through the gates, asking if they had seen anyone carrying unusual loads. Most responses were unhelpful. Yet one detail recorded by a gatekeeper began to shift their understanding. The gatekeeper claimed that several nights earlier, long before dawn, he had noticed faint movement near the field paths, as if someone carried a burden slung across their back. The figure moved quickly, and the gatekeeper did not pursue, but the memory lingered. If this figure had been the quiet thief, he was likely transporting the stolen grain to some hidden place. But where would that place be? The outskirts of Winchester contained scattered woodlands, marshy patches, and old storage structures long unused. Someone familiar with the area might find refuge among them, though surviving the winter alone would remain a difficult challenge. The constables focused on the abandoned sheds near the town edge, the same place where traces of earlier thefts had been found. When they approached, they discovered footprints pressed into the thawing earth, leading between the largest shed and a nearby thicket. Inside the shed they found only a few remnants of husks and empty cloth scraps. No person remained. The prints led into the trees, but the forest floor offered little clarity. The constables followed the trail until it faded, then reluctantly turned back. Meanwhile, within the town, people spoke of the quiet thief with mixed feelings. Some condemned him harshly, calling him a danger in a season when everyone struggled. Others, particularly widows and poorer households, felt a measure of sympathy. They knew hunger well and understood the choices it forced. In some homes, quiet prayers were offered for the thief, hoping he would not perish in the cold. These moments of compassion never made their way into official records, yet they reveal something deeper about the community's understanding of human frailty. The final mention of the thief in the surviving ledgers appears during the last stretch of winter, and it is written with a tone that suggests resignation rather than triumph. A group of laborers had gone into the wooded area near the old sheds to gather fallen branches for firewood. As they moved deeper into the trees, they came upon a small hollow sheltered by brush. There, they discovered what appeared to be a makeshift camp. A few scattered sacks lay empty, some broken pottery, a wool cloak torn at the hem, and beside these, the quiet stillness of a man who had not survived the cold. The laborers hurried back to the constables, who arrived soon after. They examined the body, though the records do not describe it in any detail. Instead, the entry simply states that a man of unknown name and origin was found dead from exposure. No stolen goods remained. No identifying objects were discovered. The constables wrote that he matched the general description of the quiet thief that had circulated in the town. With this, they concluded that the string of thefts would cease. The townsfolk reacted with a mix of relief and somber reflection. Some believed justice had taken its natural course, without the need for formal punishment. Others felt unsettled by the quiet end of a life marked more by survival than malice. Medieval towns knew hardship well, and death brought by cold was not uncommon. Yet there was something particularly haunting about a man who had moved so silently through their lives, only to vanish alone in the frost. Over the following years, small tales grew from the memory of the quiet thief. Some said he had been a displaced laborer seeking only enough food to survive. Others believed he had once belonged to a trade, but had been cast out due to misfortune. Children who grew up hearing stories about him imagined him as a shadowy wanderer who stepped only where lantern light faded. Yet the truth remains simpler and more familiar. He was likely a man living at the very edge of medieval society, shaped by poverty, limited opportunity, and the need to endure one day at a time. As you consider his story, you may find yourself reflecting on how many lives in history have unfolded quietly, without records, without triumph, and without clear endings. The quiet thief did not reshape kingdoms or alter the course of battles. He did not enter grand chronicles or leave behind relics. Instead, his life reveals the understated reality of medieval survival, a reminder that history is filled with countless individuals whose struggles never reached the center of attention. Their experiences remind you that survival in any age often depends on fragile balances, the balance between hunger and provision, the balance between safety and exposure, the balance between being seen and remaining invisible. The quiet thief lived entirely within these balances, until the winter tipped them beyond what he could endure. And as you let this story settle in your thoughts, you may find yourself wondering something simple yet timeless. How many other lives, equally quiet and forgotten, shaped the rhythms of towns like Winchester in ways that no record will ever fully capture? In the quiet days of the later medieval world, when the trade routes of Europe slowly stitched distant kingdoms together, there lived a cloth merchant whose name drifted through guild halls and taverns as if carried by a gentle breeze. His name was Gerard of Lothen, a man neither remarkable in wealth nor distinguished in reputation, yet remembered centuries later because of a single journey that ended in silence. His story begins with a simple errand on a sun-softened morning, an errand that brightened the hearts of those who wished him well, and eventually filled them with questions that no one could answer. Gerard had been born to a modest household, raised among bolts of wool and linen that filled every corner of his family shop. Nothing in his upbringing suggested that one day he would be the center of whispered tales. His childhood was unremarkable, defined by the patterned rhythm of daily life. He swept floors, carried bundles twice his size, and listened to the older merchants explain how each fabric had its own nature, its own secrets hidden within its weave. Though he never sought greatness or renown, he earned a quiet respect for his steady hands, honest nature, and gentle voice that calmed demanding customers with surprising ease. As the years passed, Gerard became known as a man of unwavering routine. At dawn, he opened the shutters of his shop. At noon, he sat on the same worn bench beneath the chestnut tree in the town square. At dusk, he hung the lantern at his doorway, letting its warm glow spill into the cobbled street. Nothing in his life hinted at adventure, yet there was one task he looked forward to with a rare spark of enthusiasm. Twice each season, he traveled to a nearby market town to exchange goods, meet with weavers, and restock the store that supported his family. These trips were neither grand nor dangerous. The road was well marked, the footpaths well trodden, and the inns along the way familiar to generations of merchants. Yet, despite the ordinary nature of these journeys, some felt that Gerard harbored a subtle fondness for the world beyond his shop walls. Perhaps it was the traveler in him that stirred whenever he heard the distant clatter of wagon wheels, or smelled the faint trace of spices on a passing caravan. Perhaps he enjoyed the quiet of the open road more than the noisy square, where customers bargained over every thread. Whatever the reason, he set out on the first morning of early spring with a calm mood and a light heart, unaware that this journey would mark the final page of his ordinary life. The morning air carried a gentle chill, softened by the promise of warmer days ahead. Birds perched on the edges of roof beams, shaking the dew from their wings, while farmers led their animals from the barns. Gerard fastened his traveling cloak, locked the door of his shop, and waved to his neighbor, a potter, who always woke earlier than the rest of the street. There was nothing hurried or anxious in his movements. His traveler's pack held simple necessities, and his coin purse contained only the amount he needed for trade. He carried no valuables, and wore no jewelry save for a small copper ring that had belonged to his late father. The road out of town wound through fields that glimmered with pale morning light. Jared walked with an easy pace, humming softly to himself, the way he often did on long journeys. He stopped once by a stone bridge to adjust the strap on his pack, and once again at a wayside shrine to leave a small coin for good fortune. He followed the same path he had walked for nearly 10 years, passing the same familiar stream and the same leaning oak tree where travelers often paused to rest. No one traveling that morning found him unusual. A few nodded to him in greeting, and he nodded back, offering the soft smile he was known for. By midday he reached the crossroads, a place marked by a wooden post with arrows pointing toward nearby villages. It was a peaceful area where merchants often gathered in small groups before continuing their journeys. Stories later recalled that Jared was seen there, speaking with a shepherd boy who had lost a stray lamb. The boy remembered nothing alarming in the merchant's manner. Jared had simply pointed him toward a patch of brush where he believed the lamb might have wandered, then continued along the path that led to the market town. This was the last confirmed sighting of him. What followed was a silence so complete that it unsettled even the most calm-hearted townsfolk. Jared did not reach the market town that evening. He did not arrive the following morning. He did not check into the inn where he always rested on the first night of travel. Days passed, and with each passing morning, the unease that settled over his home grew heavier. At first, his absence was dismissed as a minor inconvenience. Perhaps he delayed to visit a friend. Perhaps a sudden rain had slowed his pace. But as a full week stretched behind them, those who knew Jared began to feel an unfamiliar chill. He was predictable, reliable, and as regular as the turning of the seasons. For a man so deeply shaped by routine, any deviation from it carried significance. When word of his disappearance spread to nearby villages, people recalled faint memories of that morning at the crossroads. Some insisted they had seen him pause by the signpost, as if deciding whether to take a different route. Others claimed they noticed him studying a piece of parchment, though no parchment was ever found among his belongings when they searched the area. These little scraps of recollection proved impossible to weave into a single clear story. They floated like loose threads, never forming a complete fabric. A group of men from his hometown gathered at the crossroads, retracing his steps, calling his name, and searching the brush and thickets that surrounded the path. The ground bore no signs of struggle. There were no footprints leading away from the trail. There was no sign of his pack, his coins, his ring, or even the wooden button that fastened his cloak. It was as though the road had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace behind. Some villagers turned quickly to superstition, for such mysteries often stir restless imaginations. They whispered of wanderers who slipped between worlds, of crossroads spirits who misled travelers, and of ancient warnings carved into the stones beneath the soil. Yet the elders brushed aside these tales with patient voices. Such stories were meant for children, they said, not grown minds searching for reason. Still, the whispers grew, drifting through the marketplace with each retelling. Others sought explanations rooted firmly in the waking world. They wondered whether bandits had taken him, though none had been reported in that region for many years. They speculated about hidden debts, though Jared's finances were known to be modest and stable. Some questioned whether he might have chosen to vanish of his own will, but those who spent time with him insisted he carried no burdens deep enough to push him toward such an act. His disappearance became a puzzle that placed a quiet strain on those who knew him. Merchants who once chatted warmly about trade, now gathered in small tense groups, speaking in low tones as though the mere mention of his name might draw shadows nearer. His shop remained closed, its shuttered windows darkened by dust that slowly gathered in the corners. The chestnut tree beside his bench shed its early blossoms without anyone sitting beneath its branches. Weeks turned to months, and though the initial urgency faded, the quiet ache of unresolved questions lingered. His story rippled across the region, carried by travelers who repeated it in their own words. In time, it reached distant villages that had never heard his name before his vanishing transformed him into a figure of curiosity. What made his disappearance so unsettling was not the drama of the event, but its absence. There was no crime scene, no witness to any wrongdoing, no object left behind to hint at what had happened. A man simply walked down a well-known road on a calm morning, and did not reach the place he intended to go. It was the pure simplicity of the matter that unsettled people most deeply. Even years later, those who had known Gerard felt an unspoken pull whenever they passed the crossroads. Some paused there, letting the breeze wash over them as they stared down the path he had taken, wondering where the final thread of his journey had unraveled. Others avoided the area entirely, choosing routes that kept them far from the signpost that once guided the missing merchant. What remains of Gerard's final days is not a clear narrative, but a soft, lingering question that floats like a mist through the memories of those who retell it. How could a man so steady disappear so quietly? How could a well-traveled road swallow a person without leaving even the faintest trace? In the medieval world, where certainty was often elusive and mysteries were slow to fade, the story of Gerard of Lothan became a gentle reminder of the fragile balance between routine and the unknown. Though he never sought to carve his name into history, the silence of his final journey etched a lasting echo in the hearts of those who pondered his fate. And thus begins the tale that would one day be known as the merchant who vanished at the crossroads. A story woven not from grand events or heroic deeds, but from the quiet mystery of a single ordinary life that slipped softly into the folds of the unknown. As the seasons continued their slow turn, the disappearance of Gerard of Lothan settled into a quiet ache that lingered in the minds of those who had known him. At first the search had been fueled by urgency and hope, but as weeks became months and months softened into years, the sharp edge of worry dulled into a gentle, unresolved melancholy. Nothing new had been discovered, no stray clue uncovered, and no traveller came forward with news that shed light on the mystery. It was as though the world had accepted the silence, even while the roads he once walked remained unchanged. Yet stories such as this rarely remain still. They ripple outward, shaping new thoughts with each retelling. In this way, the disappearance of the merchant became more than a simple puzzle. It became a presence, something felt rather than seen, something breathed out in quiet taverns when the night grew long and the fire had burned down to embers. In the first year after Gerard vanished, the townspeople made regular visits to the crossroads. They returned to the spot where he was last seen, unsure of what they hoped to find, yet compelled by something they could not explain. Each time they stood beneath the signpost and let the wind sweep across the open fields, hoping that a new detail might reveal itself. But nature gave no answers. The grass grew and fell with the seasons. The dust settled along the path, and the signpost continued to point toward the market town, as it had for decades. What troubled people most was not the fear of bandits or the suspicion of wrongdoing. It was the way the event defied the natural rhythm of life. A man who kept a routine with such devotion simply could not vanish without stirring deeper questions. His absence was like a missing thread in a tapestry, small but noticeable, leaving a gap that the mind returned to again and again. Over time, small stories began to rise from this emptiness. They started softly, carried on the tongues of shepherds and farmers who passed through the crossroads at dawn or dusk. One shepherd claimed he heard footsteps on a morning when he was alone on the road. He insisted the steps matched the steady pace of a merchant, not hurried and not fearful, walking as though simply traveling toward the next town. Yet when he turned, there was no one behind him. Another traveler reported seeing a figure standing near the signpost at twilight, only to have it fade into the dimming light when he approached. These accounts were not dramatic, nor filled with fear. They were gentle, hazy recollections, described more as impressions than sightings. No one claimed certainty. Most admitted openly that the imagination can play strange tricks when the mind is tired or when the light is low. Still, the stories continued, and as with all whispers repeated across seasons, they took on a life of their own. At first, the people of Gerard's town dismissed such stories with patient smiles. They believed the shepherd had simply heard his own echoes across the empty road. They believed the twilight figure was nothing more than a trick of the fading sun. But as the years passed, these small moments began weaving themselves into the quiet mystery that surrounded the vanished merchant. It was during the second autumn after Gerard's disappearance that a new rumor reached the town. A traveling peddler, known for carrying news from distant villages, stopped at the local inn to rest. Over supper he mentioned hearing about a lone traveler who matched Gerard's description. According to the tale, this traveler walked with a calm stride along a road far to the north, carrying a pack that seemed too light for a merchant's journey. The peddler did not claim to have seen the man himself. He was simply repeating the tale as he had heard it. And yet, this small story revived a flicker of hope in the hearts of Gerard's friends and family. The elders discussed the rumor carefully, weighing each detail with quiet consideration. Could Gerard have wandered far from his intended path? Could he have chosen to leave his familiar life behind? The questions lingered in the air, but no one could answer them. The peddler's tale faded as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by newer stories that offered no more certainty than the last. Life continued in the town, but the memory of Gerard remained, not as a constant sorrow, but as a gentle reminder of how fragile the threads of ordinary life could be. His shop stayed closed, the shutters unmoved, and the dust settling thick along the sill. The potter, his old neighbor, often paused outside the door on warm afternoons, gazing at the weathered wood, as though waiting for the familiar creak of hinges. More than once, he found himself listening for the sound of Gerard's soft humming drifting through the open window, only to be met by silence. By the third spring, the story had reached a nearby monastery, carried by pilgrims who travelled along the trade roads. The monks, known for their habit of recording events both significant and obscure, added the tale of Gerard to their seasonal accounts. They noted the details as they were told: the merchant's departure, his cheerful mood, the shepherd boy he helped at the crossroads, and the strange silence that followed. Their record was brief, written without embellishment, but it ensured that Gerard's memory found a place beyond the borders of his hometown. From this point onward, his story began to shift. What was once a local mystery slowly became a tale carried by travelers, spoken in gentle tones beside hearthfires and at roadside inns. It was not told to frighten children, nor to warn merchants of danger. Instead, it became a quiet reflection on the unpredictability of the world, a reminder that even the most ordinary journey could hold unexpected depths. As the years passed, the crossroads itself developed a subtle reputation. Travelers sometimes paused there without knowing why, as though drawn by something just beyond their understanding. Some left small offerings upon the stone near the signpost, simple tokens such as dried flowers, polished stones, or bits of ribbon. None knew who started this custom, and no one claimed that Gerard would ever return to collect them. The offerings were gestures of gentle respect, left by people who had heard the tale and felt the weight of its silence. There was one particular spring morning that became the center of another whispered tale. A farmer returning from the early market claimed he saw a figure standing near the signpost. The figure wore a cloak of modest length, with the hood drawn low. The farmer could not see the man's face, but something about his posture reminded him of the way Gerard once stood when pausing to rest. The figure remained still for several moments before turning down the path that led away from the town. The farmer followed only briefly before feeling a quiet unease and turning back toward home. He spoke of the moment to his family, though he did not insist on its truth. He knew how the mind can fill the empty spaces of memory when a familiar story lingers in the heart. Still, those who heard his words wondered whether the merchant's spirit walked the roads he once knew so well, a gentle echo of a life interrupted. Not every part of the tale was shaped by mystery. Some of its chapters belonged firmly to the living. The shepherd boy whom Gerard had helped on the day he vanished grew older, yet he never forgot the quiet kindness of the merchant who stopped to guide him. The boy, now a young man, sometimes stood at the crossroads in the early morning, remembering the sound of Gerard's voice and the gentle smile he offered before continuing his journey. He often felt that if he closed his eyes and listened carefully, he might hear the soft rustle of the merchant's cloak in the breeze. The elders of the town occasionally gathered to reflect on the passing years. They spoke of Gerard not with fear or sorrow, but with a sense of peaceful remembrance. The potter, who had been the last to see him leave, often said that some stories are not meant to end neatly. They are meant to linger, to encourage reflection, and to remind people of the gentle uncertainty that rests within every life. As time moved forward, the town grew and changed. Yet the story of the vanished merchant remained steady, woven quietly into the rhythm of life. Children who had not been born when Gerard disappeared grew up hearing the tale from parents and grandparents. They listened with wide, thoughtful eyes, not because the story frightened them, but because it carried a softness that stayed with them long after the telling. Travelers continued to pass through the crossroads, some noticing nothing unusual, others feeling a faint sense of familiarity as they stepped along the worn path. A few paused to leave a quiet offering, though they were not sure to whom or why. It became a place touched by memory rather than sorrow, a place where the air seemed to hold the faint trace of a journey that had never been completed. In the medieval world, where certainty was rare and unanswered, questions were part of daily life. People learned to live with mysteries such as this. They understood that not every story could be resolved. Some remained open, allowing the imagination to breathe gently around the unspoken possibilities. Thus, the tale of Gerard of Lotham moved into its next chapter, shaped not by new discoveries, but by the quiet persistence of memory. His footsteps were no longer found upon the road, yet the echo of his final journey continued to drift across the crossroads, whispering to each traveler who paused beneath the wooden signpost. He had vanished, yet he had not been forgotten, and in that lingering presence, the quiet heart of his story lived on. As the years drifted onward, the memory of Gerard of Lothen became less a mystery to be solved, and more a quiet thread woven into the daily life of the region. His disappearance no longer stirred fear or speculation. Instead, it became the kind of story people carried with them as they moved from season to season, something that softened the heart rather than troubled it. Even so, the question of what truly became of him continued to move gently beneath the surface, never demanding an answer, but never quite fading either. By the time 2 decades had passed, only a few living residents still remembered the day he set out on his final journey. The potter who had spoken with him that morning now walked with a slow, careful step, his years resting heavily on his shoulders. The shepherd boy had grown into a man with a family of his own, and the peddlers who once shared the tale had long since moved on to other roads and other stories. Yet the silence of the crossroads and the soft memory of the merchant's steady kindness endured. In this later time, a small change occurred around the place where the old signpost stood. Travelers began to notice a worn stone near the base of the post, a stone with faint markings that had not been there in earlier years. The markings were shallow, carved with a hand that had worked carefully but without skill. Some believed the stone had been scratched by passers-by, who wished to leave a simple mark of remembrance. Others insisted it must have been placed by someone who knew the merchant, though no one stepped forward to claim responsibility. The markings themselves were not elaborate. They formed a symbol resembling a circle broken at one edge, as though representing a path that ended before its loop closed. This simple shape prompted quiet conversation among those who noticed it. Some saw it as a reminder of journeys unfinished. Others believed it represented the nature of life itself, always in motion but rarely complete. Whatever its meaning, the stone became a subtle landmark, a sign that someone at some time had stood there and thought of Gerard. Among those who found themselves drawn to the stone was a monk from the same monastery that had recorded the story of the merchant years earlier. The monk had travelled through the region gathering accounts of everyday life. Though his main work concerned crop yields and changes in village customs, he had heard references to the tale of the vanished traveller in nearly every settlement he visited. When he reached the crossroads, he paused beside the stone, running his hand over the faint carving. He made no claim of understanding its purpose, yet he felt that it belonged exactly where it rested, as though it had grown from the earth rather than been placed upon it. The monk stayed there for a long moment, listening to the breeze that moved across the open fields. He later wrote in his seasonal chronicle that the area had a stillness unlike any other he had encountered. Not eerie, not sorrowful, but settled. He described it as a place where the past lingered lightly, without pressing upon the present. When he continued his journey, he left a small sprig of dried heather beside the stone, a simple gesture of respect that required no explanation. Over time, more travelers began leaving small tokens, though none spoke of doing so with ceremony or expectation. A ribbon tied loosely around a branch, a smooth pebble placed carefully near the base of the post, a handful of wildflowers left to dry in the sun. These quiet offerings gathered slowly, forming a gentle tribute that changed with the seasons. No one tended them deliberately, yet the roadside never appeared neglected. Rain washed the stones clean, wind carried away faded petals, and each visitor seemed to sense instinctively where to place their small gift. In this way, the crossroads became a place not tied to fear or sorrow, but to reflection. People paused there not to seek answers, but to acknowledge the uncertainty that touched every life in the medieval world. Roads were long, seasons were unpredictable, and the world rarely offered clear explanations. The story of Gerard served as a quiet reminder that some paths ended without warning, and that not every question could be resolved. Still, life moved forward, guided by the rhythms of work, family, and community. One autumn morning, a traveling merchant from a distant region arrived at the crossroads just as the first light crept across the fields. He paused beneath the signpost and looked at the offerings scattered around its base. He had heard the story of the vanished trader during his own journeys, and felt a gentle familiarity as he stood there, though he had never met Gerard himself. As he examined the surroundings, his gaze settled on the worn stone. He crouched to look closer, and noticed that the faint carving, though weathered, remained visible. The merchant reached into his pack, and withdrew a small copper token, barely thicker than a dried leaf. It was marked with a simple circular emblem, different from the carving on the stone yet resonant in its own quiet way. He placed the token near the mark, feeling that it belonged there, though he could not explain why. When he rose to continue along the road, he carried with him a sense of peace, as though he had participated in something older and gentler than he understood. Over time, This simple pattern continued. The crossroads became a place where the memory of one man's final journey grew into a symbol of all unfinished paths. People who had never heard Gerard's name before, arriving sometimes stayed longer than expected, sensing the quiet weight of the place. Others came intentionally, having heard of the location from travelers who spoke of it with soft familiarity. They did not come to solve a mystery. They came because the crossroads offered something few places in that era provided: a moment of quiet reflection on the fragile, unpredictable nature of life. While the world around it changed, the story of the vanished merchant remained steady. The towns grew, roads shifted, and new generations walked along the paths where Gerard once traveled, yet the essence of the tale endured. It was not retold loudly, nor shaped into legend. Instead, it remained grounded in modesty, a story carried by ordinary people who felt its truth even without knowing all its details. One day, several decades after the disappearance, the shepherd boy who Gerard had helped on that final morning made his way back to the crossroads. He was older now, his hair streaked with grey and his gait slower, but he still remembered the merchant's gentle voice and steady patience. The memory had never left him. He had shared it with his children, and as he grew older found himself returning to it with greater frequency. As he approached the signpost, he noticed the worn stone, the tokens gathered around it, and the way the earth seemed shaped by countless quiet pauses. He stood for a moment, letting the early light settle across the fields. Then he knelt beside the stone, placing his hand upon the carving. He did not know who had made it, nor when, but he felt its meaning all the same. After a long silence, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a piece of polished wood he had carved himself. It bore no symbol, no name, no elaborate design. It was simply smooth, shaped by years of habit and reflection. He placed it gently beside the others, and as he did, he felt a warm sense of completion. He did not believe he would return to the crossroads again, yet he knew that this simple act was the final piece of his own connection to Gerard. As he rose, he whispered a quiet farewell, not expecting anyone to hear it. The breeze shifted lightly, rustling the tall grass at the edge of the road. He turned and continued his journey, feeling a soft peace settle over him. With time, even the older generations faded, and the details of Gerard's life grew dim. People remembered fragments, such as his kindness to travelers, his steady routine, or the way he had helped a boy find his way along the road. Yet the story endured not because of who Gerard had been, but because of what he represented: the quiet uncertainty that touched every life, and the gentle hope that lingered, even when answers could not be found. The crossroads never became a place of pilgrimage, nor a site of fear. It remained simple, unchanged, except by the slow touch of weather and the tender gestures of passers-by. Its wooden signpost continued to point toward towns that rose and fell across the generations. The worn stone remained at its base, its faint marking softened by time, and the offerings, though constantly renewed and washed away, continued to gather in their quiet rhythm. In the end, the story found its resolution not through discovery or explanation, but through acceptance. The medieval world was full of uncertainties, full of beginnings without endings. Gerard's disappearance became one of many threads woven into the tapestry of life. It was not forgotten, yet it no longer posed a question that demanded solving. Instead, it became something gentler, a quiet reminder of the fragile paths people walked, and the way those paths could vanish into silence without erasing the memory of the footsteps that once touched the earth. As you reflect on this story, you might wonder how many other lives in the medieval world ended with similar quiet absences. How many simple journeys were interrupted without warning, leaving behind unanswered questions and faint echoes along the roads. And you might consider whether the crossroads still carry those memories, lingering softly in places where countless footsteps once pressed into the earth, waiting for the next traveler to pause and listen. In the small stone town of Dunwald, nestled between rolling hills and a sluggish river, there lived a night watchman whose reputation was as quiet as it was enduring. His name was Eamon, and for decades, he patrolled the streets and alleyways long after the sun had disappeared below the horizon. Unlike other town officials whose duties often involved loud proclamations or public attention, Eamon's work required invisibility, patience, and an unwavering devotion to routine. Few paid him much notice by day, but by night his presence was the fragile thread that kept the town from slipping into chaos. Eamon was born the son of a minor tradesman, raised among the clatter of hammers and the smell of tanned leather. He learnt early how the world moved in rhythms both visible and hidden. He saw how the smithy worked steadily at dawn, how the bakers stirred the dough in the pale light of early morning, and how the market square swelled with energy before retreating into quiet by evening. These observations shaped his understanding of work, order, and the uncelebrated labor that sustains a community. His choice to become a night watchman was neither dramatic nor heroic. As a young man, he noticed that many of the town's poorer streets were left unguarded once darkness fell. Fires could spread undetected, thieves could move with impunity, and accidents often went unreported until morning. The town council had few resources to dedicate to night patrols, and the idea of a single dedicated watchman seemed almost comical. Yet Eamon, motivated by a sense of quiet duty rather than ambition, volunteered for the post. The council agreed, more out of convenience than hope. They provided him with a lantern, a short wooden staff for signaling, and a small stipend that barely covered his meals. The work was tedious. Eamon's evenings were filled with the soft footfalls of his own passage along cobblestone streets, the occasional bark of a dog disturbed by his approach, and the gentle whistle of the wind as it threaded between timbered houses. He often wondered whether his presence mattered at all, yet he persisted, drawn by the rhythm of the town after dark and the simple satisfaction of having done his duty. Eamon's patrols followed a rigid pattern, designed to ensure that every street and alley was observed at least twice each night. He started at the eastern gate as the first stars appeared, passing the same fountain that had stood for decades, then moving along the main street where merchants once lined their stalls. The night was quiet, yet he remained alert, listening for the subtle shifts in sound that marked unusual activity, the scraping of a cart against stone, the faint murmur of a door opening, or the irregular scuffle of feet that did not belong to any townsperson. Each sound demanded attention, though most proved to be nothing more than a stray cat or a careless neighbor. It was during the third month of his first winter as watchman that Eamon began to notice subtle changes. Footsteps that did not match any known pattern began appearing on the streets. Small items, left unattended in courtyards or near doorways, began to disappear overnight. At first he dismissed these occurrences as trivial or the work of wandering children. Yet the pattern persisted, growing more noticeable with each passing week. The town was not large, and the streets were familiar to him, so even the faintest irregularity drew his attention. Eamon documented these incidents carefully. Each night, when he returned to his small room near the town gate, he recorded the missing objects, the location of strange footprints, and any unusual sounds he had noticed. Over time, these notes formed a quiet map of activity that no one else in the town understood. His observations were meticulous, almost obsessive, but they were driven by a patient mind that valued knowledge over action. Eamon understood that understanding often preceded resolution, and he waited, quietly, for the pattern to reveal its purpose. The thief, though Eamon did not yet know it by that name, was clever. They moved silently, leaving no clue of identity, and took only what was necessary: small coins from the bakery, a loaf of bread left to cool on a windowsill, a piece of cloth from an unattended stall. The object was never excessive. It was practical, often sustenance for someone else, rather than an act of malice. This precision, coupled with the regularity of the thefts, intrigued Eamon. He began to consider the human needs that might drive such activity, wondering if desperation or skill guided the unseen hand that moved through his streets. One particularly cold night, when frost glazed the rooftops and the river's surface had begun to harden along its shallow banks, Eamon observed something unusual. He had paused near the central square, listening to the stillness, when a faint shadow caught the edge of his lantern's glow. He did not move immediately, recognizing that sudden action might alarm the figure. Instead, he remained motionless, staff in hand, allowing his eyes to adjust to the darkness. The shadow moved with purpose, approaching a merchant's stall that had been emptied for the evening. Within moments, the object, a small bag of grain, was gone, and just as quietly, the shadow vanished down a narrow alley. Eamon considered pursuing, but he realized that such action would risk confrontation and perhaps alert the thief to his vigilance. Instead, he waited, observing the alley where the figure had disappeared. The night was still, and the echo of his own footsteps seemed louder than any other sound. For the first time, he felt a sense of personal investment in the unfolding mystery. He knew that the thief had been clever, but Eamon was determined to learn their pattern, even if he never uncovered the person's identity. He returned to his room before dawn, his notes longer than usual. He sketched a rough map of the alleyways, indicating the locations of missing items and the likely path of the thief. In his meticulous handwriting, he began recording hypotheses about the individual's movements, noting times, distances, and possible motivations. Sleep came reluctantly, and dreams were filled with images of shadows slipping through the streets, always just beyond reach, always just out of clarity. The next several nights followed a familiar rhythm. The shadow appeared, took its modest portion, and disappeared. Eamon observed, recorded, and waited. He began to see subtle patterns in timing, in the choice of targets, in the way the figure moved. These observations strengthened his belief that this was not a reckless criminal, but a careful, intentional presence, someone aware of the town's rhythms and perhaps even dependent on the shadows that the night provided. The town itself remained unaware of the nightly vigil. In daylight, life moved with familiar cadence. Merchants opened their shops, children ran along the streets, and the river reflected the slow passage of clouds above. No one suspected that Eamon, the quiet night watchman, was engaged in a silent battle with an unseen figure whose existence was both disruptive and oddly precise. The pattern of thefts did not provoke panic or complaints. It was almost as though the town itself accepted the rhythm, unknowingly aided by the steady hand of its nocturnal observer. One evening, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Eamon followed the shadow further than ever before. He remained cautious, keeping to the dim edge of lamplight. The figure moved with deliberate care, navigating between stalls and gates with an elegance born of practice. Eamon noticed that each theft was measured, efficient, and purposeful. There was no greed, no recklessness, only necessity. In that moment, he felt a quiet empathy, understanding that this person was not a villain, but someone navigating a harsh world. And yet, despite this understanding, the question lingered: who was the shadow, and why did they move through the town with such precision? Eamon had traced the routes, recorded the patterns, and even anticipated movements. Still, the identity of the thief remained an open question, a puzzle that the night had not yet allowed him to solve. It was a delicate tension between duty and curiosity, observation and intervention, a quiet game played beneath the watchful stars. As the snowfall thickened, Eamon returned once more to his room, recording his observations in detail. The pattern was clearer now than ever before, yet the mystery remained. He realized that the figure might always evade him, leaving only faint traces and unanswered questions. This understanding did not frustrate him, for he had grown to respect the rhythm of the shadows. Instead, it deepened his appreciation for the quiet complexity of the world he patrolled. The night ended as always, with the faint glimmer of dawn breaking over the rooftops. Eamon extinguished his lantern, leaned back against the worn wooden wall of his room, and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The streets of Dunwald were safe, at least in part because he had observed, because he had moved with care and attention while others slept. The shadow remained a question mark, but it was a question that shaped the town's quiet order, and in some strange way, that was enough. And as you sit with the memory of the night watchman, you may find yourself wondering what became of the shadow that moved so carefully through Dunwald's streets. Was it a desperate resident seeking sustenance, a traveller lost to the seasons, or someone living entirely in the margins of medieval life? The answer remains as elusive as the darkness that cloaked the town each night, a puzzle left for the imagination to wander along the silent cobblestones. The nights in Dunwald settled into a rhythm, quiet but deliberate, like the turning of a slow, steady wheel. Eamon continued his patrols with patient diligence, noting patterns and recording subtle disturbances in the cobblestones, the shadows and the soft rustle of shutters in the wind. He had grown familiar with every creak of timber, every distant cough, and even the faint clinking of pots and pans from late-night kitchens. Yet the shadow he followed, the elusive midnight visitor, remained a persistent mystery, weaving in and out of his perception without ever allowing itself to be fully understood. Eamon's life, once measured by simple routines, had begun to bend subtly around this presence. He noticed that the thief did not strike randomly. Instead, there was intention, a careful consideration of what to take, when, and how. The objects were never luxurious or unnecessary. They were food, cloth, or tools, small enough to be carried without notice. Eamon had no illusions about this figure being a common bandit. The thief was more like a careful observer of the town, someone who understood the patterns of human activity and the delicate balance of need and risk. On one particularly still winter evening, Eamon discovered something remarkable. Following the faint sound of footsteps across a narrow alley, he paused behind a stack of firewood and observed the shadow carefully arranging a small pile of discarded scraps. Pieces of cloth, leftover bread, and even a few coins had been gathered neatly beside the alley wall. It was not theft in the careless sense. It was a collection for survival. There was no hint of mischief, no sign of anger or malice. The figure seemed to exist entirely in service to necessity, moving through the night as a ghost of quiet pragmatism. Eamon's own understanding deepened, yet it brought no immediate solution. He began considering the social and economic conditions that might have driven this person to roam the streets at night. The town was small, its resources limited, and many residents barely managed to scrape by. The thief, he reasoned, might have been someone forced to navigate the margins of the community, neither welcomed nor fully excluded, surviving within the narrow gaps that society overlooked. This was a man or woman shaped by circumstance rather than choice, and perhaps in a strange way their path mirrored Eamon's own dedication to unseen service. Over the following months, Eamon's observations became more methodical. He recorded not only the timing of thefts, but the routes taken, the selection of items, and the way the figure adjusted their behavior in response to changes in light, weather, and human activity. He noticed patterns tied to the cycles of the moon, and even the subtle influence of wind and frost. Each detail became part of a delicate tapestry, and Eamon treated it with a reverence born of patience and necessity. No one in the town knew the full extent of his nightly diligence. During the day he appeared to be merely a quiet, unobtrusive figure, walking the streets and keeping an eye on simple matters. By night he was the guardian of the subtle order beneath which life continued unbroken. Yet, despite these careful observations, the shadow remained elusive. Eamon began to suspect that this figure had become aware of his presence, though there was no evidence of confrontation or awareness. The thief adjusted movements, paused for longer at certain junctions, and sometimes appeared to leave behind objects as if testing whether anyone noticed. This interplay of observation created a strange rhythm between the two figures, one moving in search of survival, the other moving in quiet vigilance. Neither spoke, neither engaged directly, and yet each action influenced the next, as though the town itself had become a chessboard for their silent dialogue. One winter night, as the river's edges froze under the frost, and the town slept beneath a thick blanket of snow, Eamon witnessed something that stayed with him long afterward. The shadow appeared to pause at the base of a small wooden staircase, leading to an abandoned home. For several minutes, the figure lingered, crouching low, moving carefully, almost in deliberation. Eamon held his breath, waiting for some revelation, some clue to emerge. Yet the figure rose, adjusted the pack slung across their shoulders, and disappeared down an alley that led to the outskirts of the town, leaving no trace. The patience with which the shadow operated left Eamon both frustrated and awed. There was intelligence here, careful planning, and a respect for the town's rhythm, even while violating its property. The moonlight reflected faintly on patches of snow, revealing a subtle trail of footprints, but even this trace seemed fleeting. Wind and frost obscured most of it within hours. Eamon followed, noting the direction, the depth of the prints, and the spacing between steps. Each observation fed his understanding, yet did not bring him closer to solving the puzzle of identity. He recorded every detail in his ledger, sketches accompanying notes on distance, timing, and probable motivation. In these meticulous records, Eamon found a quiet satisfaction. Knowledge, even without resolution, offered its own kind of security. By the following spring, the shadow's activity had begun to influence the town in other ways. Residents noticed small improvements in the quiet streets where thefts had occurred, as if the thief's careful selection and timing maintained a subtle equilibrium. Eamon realized that the town had unknowingly adapted to the pattern, leaving modest offerings unattended, or ensuring that nothing unnecessary remained exposed. The midnight visitor had created, without intent, a kind of order born of subtle disruption. Life continued without panic, yet shaped subtly by the figure whose presence remained largely invisible. Despite the growing understanding, questions persisted. Why did the shadow appear at these particular intervals? What drove the careful balance of theft and selection? And most persistently, who was this figure moving through the night with such discretion and skill? Eamon began to consider broader explanations, acknowledging that some mysteries could remain unresolved without diminishing their significance. The figure represented the hidden complexity of human existence, the intersection of survival, necessity, and morality, and the delicate threads connecting individuals in a community. Eamon's reflection deepened with each passing season. He noticed that the shadow's presence had affected his own perspective on time, routine, and duty. Nights felt longer, quieter, and more meaningful. His sense of responsibility extended beyond his simple patrols. He became aware of the nuances in human behavior, the silent negotiations of need and opportunity that defined life in Dunwald. The shadow had inadvertently become a teacher, revealing through absence and careful action the hidden layers of the town's existence. In one instance, Eamon discovered an abandoned satchel near the riverbank. Inside were items that had been left behind: a loaf of bread, a small knife, and a folded piece of cloth. No identification accompanied them. He examined each item carefully, noting the care with which they were selected and placed. It was a message without words, a trace of human thought, deliberate and considered. Eamon realized that the shadow was not reckless, nor entirely solitary. There was intention, intelligence, and perhaps a quiet moral compass guiding the movements, shaping the interaction between town, observer, and unseen participant. As months passed, the town continued its gentle rhythms. Children played in the daylight streets, merchants conducted their trades, and the river reflected the slow passage of clouds above. Yet at night, beneath the canopy of stars and the glow of lanterns, the dance between Eamon and the shadow continued. Each influenced the other, though neither acknowledged it openly. The balance was delicate, almost imperceptible, yet it held firm. Eamon understood that the shadow might never be revealed, yet the interaction had already changed the town in ways subtle but enduring. It was in this delicate interplay that the essence of the story revealed itself. The shadow was not a villain, nor an invader. It was a participant in a complex system, navigating the needs of survival with respect for the structure of human life. Eamon's role, equally invisible, maintained the safety and continuity of the town. Together, in quiet coordination and silent observation, they created a dynamic neither could fully control, yet one that ensured the ongoing rhythm of Dunwald's nights. And so the story of the night watchman and the midnight visitor persists, unclaimed and unresolved. It is a tale not of dramatic confrontation, but of subtle understanding, patient observation, and the gentle negotiation between necessity and order. As you reflect on this, consider the hidden figures in the lives of towns and villages, the unknown hands that guide the balance of society quietly, and the way that even without recognition, small acts can shape the rhythm of a community. Even as you drift into thought, one question remains, lingering at the edge of awareness: who truly shaped the Knights of Dunwald, the watchman who observed, or the shadow who moved unseen? And does it matter if the town endured in quiet balance? The seasons continued their quiet passage through Dunwald, leaving frost on the rooftops in winter and dust on the streets in summer. Eamon, the night watchman, had grown older, his footsteps slower, and his eyes more attuned to subtle shifts in shadow and sound. Still, he patrolled the streets with a devotion that had become instinctual, a rhythm entwined with the town's own heartbeat. The midnight visitor, ever careful, remained a presence in the shadows, moving with precision and purpose, while never revealing more than a faint trace of identity. Years had passed since Eamon first noticed the pattern of thefts that had initially piqued his curiosity. In that time, he had come to recognize the rhythm of the shadow as a part of the town itself. Each disappearance of bread, cloth, or small coin had been absorbed into the subtle order of life. Residents who had initially fretted over missing items had adapted quietly, leaving them in places where they would do little harm, and perhaps serve those in need. In a sense, the town had grown attuned to the shadow's presence, creating a harmony that was both fragile and enduring. On one particular autumn evening, Eamon noticed a subtle change. The shadow paused in a familiar alleyway, lingered longer than usual, and seemed to hesitate as if reconsidering a step. Eamon, watching from the edge of the lamplight, observed the deliberate movements with a mix of admiration and unease. It was as though the figure understood, in some way, that it had become part of the town's quiet balance and now acted with awareness of both necessity and consequence. Eamon's own perception had shifted over time. He no longer measured his role solely by the objects he protected or the paths he walked. He recognized that the shadow's presence had deepened his understanding of human behavior, morality, and the small, almost invisible threads that connect individuals in a community. The nights were no longer merely a vigil. They had become a meditation, a study in patience, observation, and the subtle dynamics of unseen forces shaping daily life. In the early hours of a particularly cold winter night, Eamon followed the shadow more closely than he ever had. The figure moved with grace, careful to avoid any abrupt noise. It seemed aware of the watchman's presence, but did not acknowledge it. The alleyways, empty and silent, became a theater of quiet interaction, each movement deliberate yet unspoken. Eamon felt a profound sense of connection in those moments, not with the identity of the shadow, but with the intent and care that governed its actions. Eventually the night ended as it always did, with the faint light of dawn brushing against the town's rooftops. Eamon returned to his room, documenting his observations with precision, noting every hesitation, adjustment, and pattern he had witnessed. He reflected on the lessons embedded in the shadow's actions: patience, discretion, balance, and respect for the rhythm of communal life. There was no dramatic revelation, no confrontation, and no resolution in the traditional sense. Yet the understanding he had gained felt more enduring than any triumph. The following spring, the town awoke to subtle signs that the pattern had shifted once again. Items that had once been left behind, or taken with care, now remained untouched for longer periods. Eamon noticed fewer disturbances, and the shadow appeared less frequently. He considered the possibility that the figure had moved on, perhaps leaving Dunwald for another town, another alleyway, another community in need. The thought brought a quiet melancholy, tempered by the realization that the balance they had maintained together, watchman and shadow, had left a lasting impact. Residents of Dunwald never fully understood the invisible rhythm that had governed their streets for so many years. Yet, in their daily lives, subtle traces of that balance persisted. Merchants continued to leave small items with care, aware or unaware that some unseen observer might be guided by necessity rather than mischief. Children grew up learning the quiet discipline of observation, patience, and respect for others' needs. Even without knowing the story, the town itself had absorbed the lessons of those long nights, woven into the patterns of life with gentle, almost imperceptible influence. Eamon, in his final years of patrol, reflected often on the delicate relationship that had developed with the shadow. He never discovered the figure's identity. Perhaps it had been a young resident struggling to survive, or a traveler navigating unfamiliar streets with care. Perhaps it had been someone who had lived in the margins of society, moving quietly and leaving only traces that could be interpreted in myriad ways. The truth remained elusive, yet the meaning had become clear. Life in Dunwald had been subtly shaped by the convergence of observation, discretion, and necessity. The watchman eventually passed the role on to a younger successor, whose footsteps would follow the same streets, and whose eyes would learn to interpret the faint echoes of past movements. The balance, though fragile, endured. Eamon's legacy was not in grand tales of heroism, but in the quiet order he had helped maintain, the patience he had cultivated, and the understanding he had gained from a shadow that neither claimed nor was claimed. The crossroads of duty and subtle influence remained at the heart of Dunwald's history, a reminder that not all stories require dramatic conclusions to be significant. Some endure because of quiet acts, persistent observation, and respect for the invisible forces shaping daily life. Eamon's nights, and the careful footsteps of the shadow, left an imprint not in stone or in record, but in the rhythm of the town itself, felt by those who walked its streets long after the watchman's lantern had been extinguished. And as the memory of Dunwald's nights continues to linger, one may reflect on the delicate balance between necessity and morality, observation and intervention, visibility and invisibility. Perhaps the shadow was never meant to be revealed, just as the watchman's quiet diligence was never intended to be celebrated. Yet the town endured, safe and orderly, shaped by the subtle interplay of unseen lives. In the end, the story of Eamon and the Midnight Visitor leaves a question that lingers softly, inviting reflection rather than resolution. Can acts of quiet vigilance, unseen and unrecorded, shape the course of a community, as surely as the deeds recorded in history, and do the traces they leave matter even when their source remains a mystery? In the town of Calderby, a place of narrow streets and high stone walls, there lived a locksmith named Anselm. He was neither wealthy nor renowned outside the immediate region, yet his skill was unmatched, and his reputation quietly stretched across neighboring villages. Doors, chests, and locks that others deemed impossible to open were, for Anselm, simply puzzles waiting to be solved. Unlike those who sought fame through flashy feats, he valued precision, patience, and a deep understanding of mechanics over showmanship. His work was slow, meticulous, and largely unseen, yet it shaped the daily life of Calderby in ways few could measure. Anselm had inherited his trade from his father, who had once been the town's official locksmith. From childhood, he had learned the importance of subtlety, how a spring responds under pressure, how a tumbler rotates with friction, and how the smallest imperfection in a keyhole could alter the entire mechanism. He spent hours examining locks, creating duplicates, and experimenting with new techniques. While many children ran through the streets, chasing after games and noise, Anselm lingered in the quiet light of the workshop, tracing the gears and levers of locks with careful fingers, memorizing every detail as though committing the patterns to memory for life. The town itself depended more on his skill than most residents realized. Farmers trusted him to secure grain stores against theft. Merchants relied on him to protect their modest wares, and the town council occasionally consulted him on matters of safety. Yet Anselm's influence was subtle. No banners proclaimed his achievements. No crowd gathered to watch him work. Instead, his presence was woven quietly into the daily routines of Calderby, known only through the results of his labor, locked doors that held strong valuables that remained secure, and residents who slept with a calm assurance that their small possessions were safe. Despite this, Anselm's work was not without intrigue. He had, over the years, discovered subtle signs of attempts to manipulate or bypass his locks. A crooked impression here, a faint scratch there, suggested that someone had been studying his methods, yet no one ever confronted him directly, and no overt theft occurred. It was as though someone moved in the shadows, learning, testing, and occasionally probing the boundaries of his craft. Anselm, ever patient and methodical, did not rush to action. Instead, he observed, noted, and quietly adjusted his designs to counteract even the most subtle manipulations. The subtle tension of this quiet conflict became a defining aspect of his life. Anselm began to notice patterns in the attempts to interfere with his work. They were not random. They followed a rhythm that suggested knowledge of human behavior, timing, and the predictable routines of Calderby's residents. It was as if someone had entered a silent dialogue with him through the medium of locks and doors, and he was compelled to respond, not with confrontation, but with further refinement of his craft. In the early months of one particularly wet autumn, Anselm received a request that would alter the rhythm of his work in unexpected ways. A local noble, whose home was perched on a hill overlooking the town, asked him to construct a set of locks, unlike any others he had ever made. The noble spoke in hushed tones, concerned for his safety and the secrecy of certain documents and objects stored within his estate. Anselm agreed, drawn both by professional challenge and the subtle honor of being entrusted with a task of unusual importance. He approached the work with his customary care, examining each door, measuring every frame, and designing mechanisms that were intricate, reliable, and nearly impossible to bypass without knowledge of their construction. As he labored, he noticed that his own workshop was being observed in subtle ways. A few locks he had completed were tested after hours. Their springs shifted or their tumblers rotated slightly, though no one took anything from his tools or supplies. He began keeping more detailed notes, sketches, and cross-references, gradually developing an informal record of every attempt to probe his designs. This record became, over time, both a puzzle and a guide. He did not fear exposure or theft, rather he felt the quiet thrill of challenge, as if the town itself had become a stage for his subtle duel with an unseen participant. The rhythm of Calderby continued as always. Streets filled with merchants at dawn, the market square echoing with the calls of buyers and sellers, children running along cobbled lanes, and the river glinting in the early light. Yet the presence of the locksmith, and the shadow of unseen observers, shaped the town in ways barely perceptible. Locks were stronger, valuables more secure, and residents carried a quiet confidence in the safety of their homes. The invisible dialogue between Anselm and his unknown counterpart became a hidden scaffolding for the town's life, a framework of trust and vigilance that required no public acknowledgement. It was during the nights, after the workshops had closed and the streets fell into a hushed quiet, that Anselm's skill revealed its full significance. He moved among his creations, checking alignments, testing tolerances, and refining mechanisms to a degree of precision that few could appreciate. His work was not driven by fame or recognition. It was guided by a patient understanding of cause and effect, the subtle interplay between human behavior and mechanical design. Each lock was a miniature landscape of intention, a quiet statement of resilience in a world where security was fragile and threats often unseen. Yet even with his skill and diligence, the mystery of the shadowing presence persisted. Anselm could not identify who tested his locks, nor the motivations behind their interventions. Was it a fellow craftsman seeking to improve upon his methods, a thief seeking an advantage, or someone else entirely, perhaps guided by necessity, curiosity, or some unknown code of conduct? He did not attempt to confront the figure, recognizing that the puzzle itself had a value greater than any resolution. Observation, patience, and thoughtful response were enough to maintain both security and equilibrium. By the winter solstice, Anselm had completed the noble's requested locks. They were complex, delicate, and precise, a testament to decades of careful practice. Yet even as he installed the final mechanisms, he remained aware of the quiet presence that had shadowed his work for years. He felt no fear, nor irritation. Rather, he sensed a subtle respect between himself and the unseen figure. The town slept in safety, guided by the silent dance between craftsmanship and observation, and the delicate balance of trust and vigilance that neither could fully name. As the first snow fell and coated Calderby's rooftops and streets in soft white, Anselm paused to consider the invisible forces that had shaped his life. The shadow, whether friend, foe, or neutral observer, had influenced his work in ways he could not entirely articulate. He understood that the value of his craft was measured not only in the security it provided, but in the quiet lessons it offered: patience, attention, and the recognition that even small unseen acts could hold great significance in the life of a community. And so, the locksmith of Calderby continued his work, night after night, season after season, guided by a sense of duty, curiosity, and an understanding of human nature. His creations protected homes, preserved valuables, and maintained the delicate balance of the town. The shadow remained, moving through the streets with care, leaving traces that spoke of intelligence, necessity, and respect for the rhythm of life. Though the identity of the figure remained unknown, the relationship formed between them, a silent dialogue of craft, observation, and consequence, endured quietly, shaping the town in subtle and enduring ways. Even as Calderby slept beneath the snow and stars, a question lingered, unspoken and unresolved: who truly influenced whom? The locksmith shaping the locks, or the shadow shaping the locksmith? And does it matter, when the rhythm of the town endured in balance, unseen and unremarked by most? As the winter passed, and the first hints of spring touched Calderby, Anselm's quiet vigil over the town continued, though his attention had grown increasingly focused on the subtle interactions between his craft and the unseen observer who moved through the streets. The shadow that had long tested his locks, nudging him to refine, adapt, and perfect his work, had become less a source of frustration and more a partner of sorts in a silent dialogue. Each attempted breach, each faint scratch or displacement was a message, and each refinement Anselm made was his response. Neither spoke, yet both communicated through the medium of wood, metal, and human behavior. Anselm's days became a balance of creation, observation, and reflection. By daylight, he worked in the small workshop that smelled of oiled wood, heated metal, and the faint dust of filings. Keys and tumblers, locks and bolts, were handled with care, examined, and sometimes disassembled to see how they had endured the night. Each mechanism told a story: a worn edge indicated repeated use, a slight misalignment suggested careful probing, and an unfamiliar scratch could hint at an intelligence that went beyond the ordinary thief. He recorded every detail meticulously, sketching diagrams in margins, and noting the time of each intervention. His notebooks were not just technical manuals, they were chronicles of an ongoing conversation that only he and the shadow could understand. Evenings were quieter, filled with the town's transition from the bustle of daily life to the stillness of darkness. Anselm would close his workshop's shutters, light a single lantern, and begin his patrols, following the rhythm of the streets he knew so well. The sound of a distant cart, the faint creak of a door, the occasional cough, each became cues in the map of the town that he carried in his mind. He moved slowly, deliberately, allowing his eyes to adjust to shadow and lamplight, listening for the subtle dissonances that might indicate the presence of the figure who had long walked unseen among the residents of Calderby. One spring night, as the scent of damp earth and budding greenery drifted through the streets, Anselm noticed a change in the shadow's pattern. The figure lingered longer near certain doors, paused at unusual angles, and seemed to hesitate before moving onward. Anselm, careful not to intrude, observed these shifts with curiosity. It became evident that the shadow was adapting to him, as he had adapted to it. The silent dialogue had evolved, each action influenced the other, shaping the town's rhythm in ways neither could fully articulate. This mutual awareness introduced a new layer of complexity to Anselm's work. He began considering psychological patterns as much as mechanical ones. The shadow's likely knowledge of human behavior, its probable anticipation of his responses, and its subtle testing of boundaries. Locks were no longer simply objects to secure, they had become instruments in a quiet negotiation, each mechanism a sentence, each thwarted attempt a paragraph, and each successful defense a chapter in an ongoing narrative neither participant could fully read. The town itself, unaware of this intricate interplay, continued its ordinary rhythms, yet the invisible conversation shaped its security and order in profound ways. Anselm also began to notice the ethical dimensions of this silent exchange. The shadow was careful to take only what was necessary, leaving behind signs that suggested minimal disruption to Calderby's residents. It was neither reckless nor malicious, but calculated and precise. In this, Anselm saw more than skill. He saw a code of conduct that respected human need while navigating moral ambiguity. The observation deepened his own understanding of restraint and responsibility. His role was not simply to secure property, but to maintain balance, guided by careful judgment rather than arbitrary authority. On a cool night, when the moon hung low and silver over the rooftops, Anselm made a subtle adjustment to one of the town's outer gates, a complex lock he had designed months earlier. He tested it with precision, ensuring that it would respond correctly to authorized keys while remaining resistant to intrusion. Later, he noticed faint traces in the snow of someone examining the gate, small footprints that paused and retreated in measured fashion. He did not pursue the shadow, but recorded the evidence with care. The interaction had become a quiet game of observation, strategy and mutual understanding, played without confrontation or recognition. The townspeople remained unaware of these nightly exchanges. They lived their lives with confidence in their locks, doors and possessions, trusting that the security mechanisms were sufficient. Yet the real protection lay not only in Anselm's craftsmanship, but in the subtle shaping of behavior he had cultivated over years of careful observation. The shadow, in turn, moved within constraints established by Anselm's awareness and diligence, respecting the boundaries he had enforced. Together, in silence, they maintained a balance that neither would fully acknowledge, but both relied upon. As the weeks turned to months, Anselm began reflecting on the broader implications of his work. He considered how many unseen forces influenced life in a medieval town. Neighbors who watched quietly, traders who left goods in predictable places, and individuals who acted in secrecy for reasons that might never be understood. In this light, the interaction with the shadow was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger web of subtle coordination, each action and reaction contributing to the stability of Calderby in ways largely invisible to its residents. The locksmith also recognized the lessons that extended beyond mechanics. Patience, careful observation, and respect for the unseen rhythms of life were as valuable as any technical skill. He saw that influence could be exerted without force, that guidance could be given without words, and that balance could be maintained through understanding rather than domination. The silent dialogue he shared with the shadow became a meditation in action, a study of the quiet forces that shaped human experience in a world often marked by unpredictability. Late one night, Anselm discovered an abandoned set of tools near the edge of the marketplace, small, precise instruments that appeared to have been left deliberately rather than forgotten. He examined them closely, noting that the craftsmanship suggested knowledge of locks but with a slightly different style than his own. It was a message, he realized. The shadow had left a token of recognition, an acknowledgement of his vigilance and the subtle dance they had shared over years. He did not take offense or attempt to identify the owner. Instead, he returned the tools to the workshop, carefully storing them and recording the encounter in his ledger. The relationship between locksmith and shadow persisted, a pattern of quiet observation and careful response that had become integral to the town's rhythm. Anselm's nights were filled with purposeful movement, yet tempered by reflection. Each lock tested, each mechanism refined, each subtle adjustment became part of a continuous process, a dialogue without words that shaped Calderby in ways larger than its citizens could perceive. The shadow remained an unseen partner, an agent of necessity, and a reminder of the complexity that lay behind ordinary life. And so the story of Calderby's locksmith deepens, offering a meditation on patience, ethics, and subtle influence. It is a tale of quiet vigilance, of invisible conversations, and of the ways ordinary people interact with forces that remain largely unknown. While the identity of the shadow is never revealed, its presence has shaped not only Anselm's craft, but the town itself, leaving a lasting imprint that resonates in the rhythms of daily life, long after the lamps are extinguished and the streets are empty. The question remains, soft and persistent, can unseen forces, acting with subtlety and restraint, guide a community as surely as those whose names are recorded in history? And what does it mean when the most influential actions are invisible to all but a single observer? The months in Calderby moved with the measured pace of turning seasons, leaving frost on the cobblestones in winter and dust along the streets in summer. Anselm, now older, had spent decades perfecting the craft of locksmithing and observing the shadow who had silently tested his skill. Though years had passed, the delicate interaction between creator and unseen observer remained a quiet center of his life. Each night, as the town fell into stillness, he patrolled the streets with the diligence of someone who understood that the security of a community depended not on speed or force, but on patience, precision, and vigilance. The Shadow's presence had evolved over time, where once it had tested locks aggressively, probing with relentless curiosity, now it moved with careful discretion, almost as if acknowledging the lessons of restraint and balance that Anselm had cultivated. There were fewer signs of tampering, subtler adjustments, and moments where the figure seemed to step lightly around areas where Anselm's craft had reached its most perfected form. The locksmith understood this not as surrender, but as mutual understanding, a quiet respect between two beings acting within a framework of necessity and ethics. By midwinter, Anselm began to consider the long-term impact of his work. The town's residents, unaware of the intricate dialogues taking place in the shadows, went about their daily routines with a sense of safety that he had helped cultivate. Locks held fast, valuables remained secure, and the quiet rhythm of life continued uninterrupted. The shadow, though unseen, had played a role in this system, and Anselm recognized that influence could exist without acknowledgement, and protection could exist without recognition. The most profound changes, he realized, often went unnoticed. One particularly cold night, Anselm discovered a faint trail leading from a recently reinforced door to the outskirts of the town. He followed cautiously, noting the subtle impressions in frost and soil, understanding that this could be the last opportunity to witness the figure's movements in a season when clarity of observation was possible. The trail led to a small abandoned shed near the riverbank, where the shadow paused, crouched low, and appeared to inspect a set of items carefully arranged on the ground. A loaf of bread, a small knife, and a few coins were placed with deliberate attention, forming a silent tableau that spoke of necessity, intelligence, and care. Anselm did not approach. He watched from the edge of shadow, recognizing that the moment was not about discovery, but observation. The figure eventually rose, adjusted the pack on its shoulders, and moved into the darkness beyond the river, leaving no trace of identity. For the first time, Anselm felt the full weight of absence. The shadow's departure did not bring fear, anger, or frustration, only a quiet acknowledgement that the unseen force that had shaped so many nights was no longer present. Yet the town would remain shaped by its influence, its lessons etched into the habits of its people, and the discipline of Anselm's craft. In the months that followed, Anselm's work shifted subtly. Without the shadow's presence to probe and challenge him, he continued refining locks, training apprentices, and ensuring the security of Caldaba, but he carried with him a deeper understanding of human behavior, ethics, and subtle influence. He saw that vigilance could extend beyond physical mechanisms, into observation, patience, and the cultivation of trust. The shadow had been a teacher as much as it had been a challenger, and its absence created a quiet space for reflection rather than emptiness. The residents of Calderby continued their lives, largely unaware of the invisible threads that had maintained their safety. Merchants left goods with care, families protected their homes, and children grew up with an intuitive understanding of caution and responsibility, all shaped by the indirect influence of the watchful locksmith and the shadow who had moved unseen. Anselm understood that history is often recorded in grand gestures, yet the most enduring lessons sometimes arise from the quiet, invisible forces that guide ordinary people in extraordinary ways. Anselm, in his final years of active work, passed the knowledge of his craft to apprentices, who would continue to maintain the town's security. He emphasized not only technical skill, but the ethical considerations of observation and restraint, teaching that vigilance and understanding could coexist without intrusion or harm. The story of the shadow remained a silent part of these lessons, a tale without a name but full of meaning, illustrating the delicate balance between necessity, morality, and influence. One evening, as the sun dipped behind Calderby's stone walls and cast long shadows across the streets, Anselm reflected on the quiet legacy of the locksmith and the shadow. The town had endured through careful observation, patient refinement, and subtle collaboration with forces that remained unseen. Security had not been enforced solely by locks, but by understanding, patience, and the careful shaping of behavior. In this, Anselm realized that true influence is often invisible, and the most significant acts may leave no mark beyond the continued rhythm of life itself. As the lanterns flickered, and the streets grew silent, the memory of the shadow lingered like a whisper on the wind. Anselm had never known the figure's identity, nor the full scope of its intentions, yet its presence had shaped him, his craft, and the town of Calderby in ways subtle but enduring. The narrative was complete, not through resolution or confrontation, but through the enduring rhythm of ordinary life, maintained by extraordinary patience and observation. In the quiet reflection of this story, one may consider the lasting question: how often do unseen forces guide communities, shape behavior, and preserve order without recognition? And what lessons might remain if we pay closer attention to the subtle patterns of care, restraint, and quiet vigilance that unfold around us each day? In the village of Harrowfield, nestled between rolling hills and winding streams, there lived a baker named Morel. She was not a figure of grand renown, nor did she hold wealth beyond the modest comforts of her shop. Yet her presence was woven into the rhythm of village life, as constant and reliable as the rising sun. Her days began before dawn, when the air was crisp and heavy with the scent of frost, and her hands kneaded dough with a precision honed over decades. The village depended on her bread not merely for sustenance, but for the subtle stability it brought, each loaf a quiet reassurance of continuity in an often unpredictable world. Morel's shop was a narrow, timbered building that had seen generations of bakers before her. The wooden counters were worn smooth by years of use, and the stone oven radiated heat into the small room, transforming flour, water, and yeast into sustenance for the village. The work was repetitive, measured, and unremarkable to the casual observer, yet in its quiet rhythm, Morel found both purpose and a form of meditation. Each loaf required attention to detail: the precise folding of dough, the timing of the rise, the careful monitoring of heat. Even a small miscalculation could lead to uneven bread, disappointing the villagers and disrupting the delicate flow of daily life. Morel observed the seasons as much as she observed her dough. In the spring, the river swelled with melting snow, bringing a cool dampness to the air that required subtle adjustments in moisture for her bread. In the summer, the long days and rising temperatures demanded careful attention to timing and storage, lest the heat spoil the delicate balance of yeast and flour. Autumn brought winds and rain that cooled the village streets and thickened the dough in unexpected ways, while winter demanded warmth, patience, and endurance as frost crept through the cracks in doors and windows. Each season shaped not only the bread she baked, but the rhythm of life in Harrowfield itself. The villagers relied on more than her bread. They relied on her constancy. Letters for the local council were often left at her counter. Small coins and messages passed quietly, and sometimes a loaf was shared with a neighbor who had little to spare. Morel noticed the subtle patterns in need: which families required more bread in harsh winters, which tradesmen were more likely to sell extra produce in exchange for small offerings, and which children lingered near the shop, watching the kneading and the folding of dough with curious eyes. Her observations were quiet, almost imperceptible, yet they allowed her to adapt her work to serve the village in ways that were practical, compassionate, and largely unnoticed. Despite the ordinariness of her days, Morel had developed a keen understanding of human behavior. She recognized the ways in which small actions shaped larger outcomes: a loaf placed carefully in a basket, a reserved seat at the counter for a weary traveler, or a conversation overheard at the window could ripple outward, influencing decisions, behaviors, and relationships in subtle ways. She measured these interactions not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity, noting patterns that others overlooked, and finding satisfaction in the invisible order she helped maintain. Yet, her work was not without intrigue. On many nights, as she returned from collecting flour or preparing dough for the next morning, Morel would notice signs of subtle disturbances: a missing bundle of firewood, footprints in the mud, or a displaced sack of grain hinted at the presence of an unseen figure moving through the village. There was no evidence of violence or recklessness, only small interventions, precise and deliberate. Her first instinct was to be wary, but over time she recognized the pattern. The disturbances were guided by necessity, perhaps by someone who understood the rhythms of the village as well as she did, yet operated outside its formal boundaries. Morel began adjusting her work subtly in response. She prepared slightly extra bread for certain nights, rearranged deliveries, and observed the locations where the disturbances occurred. There was a tacit negotiation unfolding, quiet and without confrontation, between her awareness and the unseen presence. Each adjustment she made was careful and thoughtful, guided by observation, experience, and a sense of ethical responsibility. The village continued its ordinary routines, yet the invisible influence shaped the rhythm of its nights in ways few could perceive. Her workdays followed a pattern that allowed her both to observe and participate in the life of the village. Dawn brought the kneading of dough and the warming of the oven. Mid-morning brought the opening of the shop and the first customers, and afternoons were reserved for preparation, observation, and reflection. Evenings were a time for quiet vigilance when she could notice subtle patterns, the flow of people, and the faint signs of intrusion or need. Each action was deliberate, a small but meaningful contribution to the village's order and well-being. Morel's understanding of necessity and restraint extended beyond her work. She observed the seasons, the weather, and the behaviors of both villagers and travelers with a careful eye, recognizing that small changes could have outsized effects on stability and survival. A storm that delayed deliveries, a flood that washed away a bridge, or a harsh winter that limited resources could all disrupt the delicate balance of village life. Her role was to maintain constancy, to act with foresight, and to ensure that the rhythms she cultivated in the shop extended outward into the community in subtle, sustaining ways. And yet, as she moved through her days, Morel remained acutely aware of the limitations of her knowledge. The unseen figure continued to move through the village, leaving traces that challenged her understanding and invited reflection. The pattern was not predictable, nor entirely understandable. It demanded patience, careful observation, and a willingness to adapt. In this quiet tension, Morel discovered both humility and purpose, recognizing that her role was not to dominate or control, but to maintain balance and respond thoughtfully to forces both visible and invisible. As the sun set over Harrowfield, and the streets settled into quiet, Morel paused at her shop's doorway, listening to the faint sounds of the village at rest. The rhythm of life continued, shaped by ordinary acts of diligence, observation, and care. Her hands, coated with flour and strength, rested on the counter as she contemplated the unfolding patterns of the village, the seasons, and the unseen figure whose presence quietly influenced her work. It was a rhythm she had come to know intimately, one measured in dough, footsteps, and subtle interventions, each element contributing to a delicate balance that ensured the survival and cohesion of the community. And yet, as you listen to the story of Morel, a question lingers quietly in the mind, inviting reflection. How much of the village's stability depended not on her skill alone, but on the unseen presences that moved through the night, shaping life with silent, careful influence, and how many of these unseen forces go unrecognized in the course of history. The nights in Harrowfield had a rhythm all their own, distinct from the bustling days filled with the smells of fresh bread and the hum of villagers' voices. As the evening mist settled over the cobblestone streets and the river's reflection shivered under the pale light of the moon, Morel moved with quiet purpose. She would check her stock, prepare dough for the next morning, and more importantly, observe the subtle signs of activity that hinted at the presence of the unseen figure she had begun to anticipate. Over time, she had learned to recognize the rhythms of the village at night, which doors closed with a firm latch, which windows creaked under the weight of frost, and which footfalls carried the deliberate caution of someone who knew they were being observed. The figure remained elusive. There were no confrontations, no hurried escapes, only the faint traces left behind, a shifted crate, a carefully placed bundle of firewood, footprints that paused and resumed in deliberate fashion. It was clear to Morel that this was no ordinary intruder. Whoever moved through Harrowfield in the dark had patience, intelligence, and perhaps a quiet moral code that governed their behavior. They did not steal for amusement or greed, but operated according to some unseen necessity, navigating the village in a way that respected both its order and the people who lived within it. Morel began to anticipate the figure's movements. She would adjust the arrangement of supplies near her shop, leave a small loaf in a basket in a corner where it could be taken without consequence, or prepare a few extra ingredients in areas where she suspected they might be needed. Each action was deliberate, a quiet negotiation in a silent game that neither participant fully controlled. The figure in turn responded with subtlety, careful avoidance, measured placement, and a consistency that suggested an understanding of the village's delicate balance. It was a dialogue without words, a series of small actions that conveyed intention, respect, and adaptability. The ethical implications of this nightly interaction weighed heavily on Morel, though she carried them with a calm sense of purpose. She realized that the unseen figure's presence allowed her to think beyond the mechanics of her craft, beyond the routine of kneading dough or managing her shop. Her vigilance had become a form of moral engagement, an exercise in empathy, foresight, and careful judgment. In responding to the patterns left by the figure, she shaped not only her own behavior, but indirectly, the behavior of the village itself. The nights became a classroom in subtle influence, patience, and ethical observation. On one particularly still winter evening, Morel followed the faint impressions left near the edge of the marketplace. Footprints in snow led toward a small storage shed, where the figure had paused, leaving behind a bundle of neatly folded cloth alongside a loaf of bread. She did not confront the figure, but she lingered quietly, absorbing the scene. It was as if the arrangement itself were a message, demonstrating not only a need for survival, but a careful attention to balance, discretion, and consequence. Morel recognized the lesson. Even in the absence of explicit communication, actions could convey meaning, shape outcomes, and preserve harmony within a community. As the weeks passed, the interplay between Morel and the figure grew more intricate. She developed a heightened awareness of the subtle cues in the village. The slight movement of shutters, the faint aroma of bread carried through an open window, or the arrangement of supplies left in predictable locations. Each observation informed her actions, allowing her to respond in ways that maintained the equilibrium she and the unseen figure were quietly negotiating. The village itself remained largely oblivious, yet its life and order were influenced in ways both tangible and imperceptible. This ongoing silent dialogue also affected Morel's perception of her craft. Baking, once primarily a technical pursuit of precision and timing, became a vehicle for engagement with the village's rhythms and the unseen presence that moved among its residents. She began to experiment with subtle variations, adjusting recipes, rearranging supplies, and modifying routines to accommodate both the needs of the village and the patterns of the figure who shadowed the streets at night. Each loaf, each adjustment, became part of a larger system, a web of cause and effect that extended beyond the walls of her shop. Morel's reflections extended to the moral and practical implications of necessity. She understood that the figure's interventions were guided by survival, not malice, and that responding with understanding rather than confrontation preserved harmony. In this way, her actions mirrored the quiet wisdom of the unseen figure. Discretion, careful observation, and restraint were often more powerful than any overt assertion of control. The village, without fully realizing it, was sustained by this shared understanding, and the invisible network of ethical action quietly maintained its stability. The seasons continued their slow cycle, leaving frost and snow, rain and sun, in turn shaping the village and its inhabitants. Morel found herself increasingly attuned to the passage of time, the patterns of human behavior, and the subtle signals left by the unseen figure. Each night became an exercise in observation, reflection, and careful response, reinforcing the quiet balance of Harrowfield. The figure's actions remained deliberate, thoughtful, and measured, and Morel learned to interpret these as lessons not only in survival, but in ethics, patience, and communal responsibility. In the early hours of a spring morning, Morel discovered a small bundle left at the edge of her doorway: bread, a folded piece of cloth, and a handwritten note, so delicate and brief that it could easily have been overlooked. The note contained no signature, no explanation, only a few words suggesting care and acknowledgement of her vigilance. For the first time, she felt a sense of connection with the figure, a recognition that their silent dialogue had become mutual. The village, the baker, and the unseen presence were engaged in an ethical and practical collaboration, each influencing the other in subtle but meaningful ways. As the light of dawn spread across Harrowfield, Morel reflected on the interplay between necessity, observation, and morality. The figure had not only influenced her behavior, but had helped shape the rhythm of the village, reinforcing lessons in patience, empathy, and careful intervention. Each night's observations, each adjustment, and each subtle exchange became part of a larger narrative of quiet stewardship, revealing that influence and guidance could exist without recognition or reward. And as the village continued its daily routines, a thought remained quietly suspended. In a world where so much effort goes unnoticed, how often do unseen forces preserve the rhythm of life, guide ethical behavior, and sustain communities, without leaving a single mark in the official record of history? The village of Harrowfield had settled into a familiar pattern by midsummer. The river glinted under long days of sunlight. The wind carried the scents of baking bread through narrow streets, and the villagers moved with a sense of measured routine. Morel's shop, with its warm stone oven and polished wooden counters, remained a cornerstone of daily life, not because of grandeur, but because of consistency. Each loaf of bread reflected not only her skill, but the careful observation she had developed over years of engaging with the village's rhythms and the subtle movements of the unseen figure who had silently shaped her understanding of necessity, ethics, and community. The figure's presence, once frequent and probing, had become increasingly rare. Small signs, a displaced sack of flour, a careful adjustment of a bundle of firewood, a faint footprint near the edge of the marketplace, appeared sporadically, each carefully measured, each deliberate. Morel did not attempt to confront or identify the figure. She had learned that the value of this presence lay not in discovery, but in the dialogue it inspired. The silent exchange between her awareness and the figure's careful interventions, a negotiation of balance, restraint, and subtle guidance. In this quiet interaction, the village itself was the beneficiary, though largely unaware. One evening, after the sun had dipped below the hills and the streets glimmered with fading light, Morel stepped outside her shop to find a carefully arranged pile of items: a loaf of bread, a small bundle of cloth, and a few coins left as a gesture of acknowledgement. It was clear that the figure had intentionally left this gift, not out of necessity, but as recognition of the quiet collaboration that had been sustained for so long. Morel paused, absorbing the moment, realizing that their unspoken dialogue had achieved a subtle harmony that protected the village and honored the principles of restraint, foresight, and empathy. The remainder of that summer passed in a gentle rhythm. Morel continued her daily work, kneading, baking, selling, observing, but her awareness of unseen influence had deepened. She noticed patterns in the villagers' behavior that had previously gone unremarked: a merchant leaving extra produce at a neighbor's doorstep, a child pausing to help another who struggled with a load, the way families adjusted routines based on minor disruptions in the town. Each of these small actions reflected a web of influence, both visible and invisible, that bound the village together. The lessons imparted by the unseen figure extended beyond the shop, shaping the life of the community in ways both subtle and enduring. Autumn brought cooler air, misty mornings, and the quiet turning of leaves along the riverbanks. Morel found herself reflecting on the nature of unseen influence, considering how many lives were shaped by forces that left no mark in official histories. The silent presence had acted with both skill and morality, reinforcing the understanding that guidance could exist without recognition, and that the most meaningful acts of stewardship were often those that remained invisible. The village, maintained through patience, careful observation, and ethical action, thrived in ways that were both ordinary and profound. The figure did not return frequently, yet its impact was evident in the stability that persisted. Morel adjusted her routines with subtlety, responding to the village's needs, the patterns of the seasons, and the lessons embedded in the previous years of silent collaboration. Her understanding of vigilance, morality, and responsibility was richer than any technical skill could provide. She realized that the unseen forces shaping communities often did so quietly, through careful attention to patterns, respect for human behavior, and an unspoken commitment to balance. In the winter that followed, the village experienced one of the harshest seasons in decades. Snow fell heavily, rivers froze along their edges, and the nights grew long and biting. Morel prepared extra bread, fortified her supplies, and watched over the community with heightened care. Though the figure's presence was not observed, its influence lingered, evident in the villagers' adaptive responses and the smooth continuity of daily life despite harsh conditions. The lessons of restraint, patience, and subtle intervention, imparted silently over previous years, proved invaluable in preserving the village's cohesion. Morel's final reflections on this collaboration were not of triumph or conquest, but of quiet satisfaction. She understood that her role, like that of the unseen figure, was to sustain balance, to observe, and to act with discretion. The village had flourished not because of a single effort or heroic act, but because of the accumulation of ordinary diligence, attentive observation, and ethical engagement with the forces both visible and invisible. The bread she baked, the observations she made, and the silent dialogue she shared had ensured that Harrowfield remained a place of stability, care, and subtle interdependence. As the years passed, Morel trained apprentices to continue the work of the shop, emphasizing not only the mechanics of baking, but the lessons of observation, patience, and ethical responsibility. She spoke rarely of the unseen figure, treating the knowledge as a quiet wisdom to be understood rather than a story to be told. The rhythm of the village continued, shaped by acts that went largely unnoticed but were no less significant. The unseen figure, whether a wanderer, a survivor, or a quiet agent of necessity, had left an enduring legacy in the village's patterns, habits, and subtle order. The story of Morel and the unseen presence concludes without dramatic confrontation or revelation. There is no resolution in the conventional sense, only the enduring impact of careful observation, subtle guidance, and ethical action on the life of a community. It leaves a gentle question lingering in the mind. How many communities are sustained by unseen hands, guided by quiet vigilance, and shaped by ordinary people, acting with foresight and restraint, whose efforts will never be recorded, but whose influence quietly endures? In the modest town of Brindleford, nestled along a slow-flowing river, and surrounded by dense woodlands, there lived a candlemaker named Edric. His shop was small and unassuming, tucked between the tannery and a cobbler's stall, but the light it produced played an outsized role in the life of the town. Edric's candles were not just a source of illumination. They marked the passing of hours, the rhythm of work and rest, and the celebrations and rituals that structured the community. Though simple in appearance, the careful crafting of wax and wick required skill, patience, and a profound understanding of materials that few outside the trade could appreciate. Edric had learned his craft from his father, who had been a candle maker for generations. From the earliest days of his apprenticeship, he was taught to respect the subtle qualities of beeswax and tallow, the precise dimensions of a wick, and the delicate balance between flame and material. A candle that burned too quickly could disrupt the timing of evening prayers, or leave a household in darkness during crucial hours. One that smoked excessively could blacken walls, spoil food, or distract from careful study. Edric's work demanded attention to detail, foresight, and an understanding of both the physical and social significance of his creations. The town relied on Edric more than most residents realized. Clergy used his candles for rituals and services, merchants for extended hours of trade, and households for reading, cooking, and navigating the long winter nights. Every candle he made was a testament not only to technical skill, but to his understanding of the human experience. He watched carefully how light shaped behavior, when workers lingered at benches too late, when families gathered for meals, and when scholars pored over manuscripts in quiet corners. Each observation informed his craft, guiding him to adjust wax blends, wick lengths and sizes to accommodate the rhythms of Brindleford. Yet there was another, hidden dimension to his work. Edric had discovered early on that candles could conceal secrets. Hollowed cores could hide small notes, rings, coins, or other objects meant to be transported unnoticed. In times when messengers were scarce and travel hazardous, a candle could be a carrier of information, a discreet medium for communication. Over the years, he had developed a system for creating such concealments without compromising the structural integrity of the candle or the quality of its light. It was a delicate process, one that required patience and precision, but it allowed messages and valuables to move through the town and its surroundings with minimal risk of discovery. This practice did not go unnoticed. Some in Brindleford suspected that Edric's candles were more than they appeared, and whispers occasionally spread about the candlemaker who knew what no one else knew. Travelers spoke of discreet parcels passed from house to house, and certain townsfolk relied on his discretion to preserve family heirlooms or deliver urgent messages. Edric maintained a careful balance. He aided those who required secrecy while ensuring that his work remained unremarkable to casual observers. His reputation for reliability and craftsmanship grew quietly, without flourish or public acknowledgement, but it reached far beyond the modest confines of his shop. Edric's work was further complicated by the seasonal demands of Brindleford. Winters brought long nights and scarce fuel, requiring him to stretch each candle's burn time. Summers demanded resistance to heat and melting, and damp autumns required careful attention to wax density. Each adjustment influenced the final product, not merely in appearance or light, but in subtle utility and endurance. His craft was as much about observing the natural world as it was about shaping it, understanding the interplay of temperature, humidity and material properties, alongside human behavior and community needs, created a layered and complex set of responsibilities for the seemingly simple trade of candle making. Over time, Edric began to notice subtle signs that someone else was aware of his hidden practice. Small disturbances near his shop, faint impressions on pathways, and hints of observation suggested that a figure moved deliberately through the streets at night, possibly testing the integrity of his work or attempting to uncover secrets he had never disclosed. At first, he felt unease, but over the months, this attention became less threatening and more a form of challenge, a silent dialogue between his understanding of craft and the knowledge, skill or curiosity of another. He began to anticipate interventions, adjusting hidden compartments and reinforcing secrecy without disturbing the outward appearance of his candles. The rhythm of Brindleford continued largely unaware of this hidden exchange. Merchants conducted trade under the light of Edric's candles, children read by flickering flames, and families relied on steady illumination to organize their homes. Yet within this ordinary scene, the candle maker and the shadowing figure engaged in an invisible dialogue, shaping the town's security, communication, and trust through subtle action. The effectiveness of his work depended not only on technical skill but on observation, foresight, and a keen understanding of human behavior, lessons learned in years of quiet practice and patient adaptation. Edric also considered the ethical dimensions of his hidden work. Concealment could be used for theft, deception, or manipulation, yet he had chosen to restrict its use to cases of necessity, survival, and discreet communication. Each decision carried responsibility to preserve the trust of the townspeople, to prevent harm, and to respect the balance between secrecy and transparency. The silent figure who observed his work at night seemed to operate under a similar code, leaving subtle traces that acknowledged care, intelligence, and restraint, rather than malice or recklessness. Their interaction became a study in mutual influence, ethics, and the quiet art of shaping behavior without direct confrontation. As the candlemaker's skill matured, so did his understanding of influence and observation. He noticed how small acts, placing a candle at a certain height, providing extra illumination near doorways, or concealing a message in a particularly prominent candle, affected the rhythm of the town. Work hours shifted, conversations were guided by the presence of light, and hidden communications allowed coordination across households and merchants, in ways that remained largely invisible to casual observation. Edric's craft had become a form of social engineering, subtle and invisible, shaping Brindleford without fanfare or recognition. In the quiet moments of early morning, when the town slumbered and the air carried the faint scent of melting wax and smoke, Adric often paused to reflect on the unseen figure who shadowed his shop. Was it a messenger, a rival, or simply someone curious about his craft? He did not know, nor did he attempt to discover the identity. The dialogue was not about exposure or victory, but about refinement, ethics, and the shared rhythm of observation and response. Each night's interaction informed the next day's work, creating a layered cycle of patience, vigilance, and subtle communication. The candlemaker of Brindleford remained an ordinary figure in the eyes of most, yet his influence, the quiet lessons of observation, and the hidden networks he facilitated, shaped the community in ways profound but largely unremarked. Candles illuminated streets, homes, and gatherings. They carried messages, preserved valuables, and guided behavior. Within their simple wax and wick lay a sophisticated understanding of material, human behavior, and ethical responsibility. And through it all, the presence of the shadowing figure created a dialogue that deepened Edric's awareness, patience, and appreciation of the delicate balance that sustained Brindleford. Even as the townspeople slept, warmed by light and routine, a question remained unspoken. How often do ordinary craftspeople, through quiet diligence and subtle innovation, shape the safety, communication, and cohesion of a community without recognition, and what unseen influences have guided them to act with patience, foresight, and care? The nights of Brindleford had grown longer with the approach of winter, and with them came a subtle intensification of Edric's work. Candles burned brighter in the hearths of homes, flickering in rhythm with the quiet life of the town. Edric found himself reflecting on the unseen figure who had shadowed his movements, leaving faint traces of attention in the margins of his daily routine. The disturbances were small, a slightly shifted bundle of wax, a hollowed core rearranged, but they spoke volumes. The figure's presence was no longer threatening. It had become a quiet collaboration, a dialogue conducted through wax flame and subtle observation. Edric began to anticipate the figure's likely routes and patterns. He noticed how the shadows of street lamps stretched differently, depending on the time of evening, how the breeze carried the faint scent of melting tallow, and how the town's inhabitants moved in response to the light he provided. Each observation informed his adjustments. Hidden compartments were reinforced or repositioned. Candles were placed to illuminate areas that required subtle guidance, and supplies were arranged to accommodate the patterns of night movement. The interplay between light and shadow became not just a technical concern, but a tool for understanding human behavior, necessity, and discretion. The ethical dimensions of these interactions weighed heavily on Edric, yet he approached them with quiet diligence. The hidden compartments in his candles could serve any purpose, and yet he chose to use them only to assist those who needed discretion for survival, communication, or the preservation of trust. In the hands of the shadow, the same mechanisms became a subtle test, an observation of skill, foresight, and responsibility. Edric learned that mastery of craft was inseparable from mastery of judgment. The ability to act responsibly in secret carried as much significance as any technical achievement. Winter's approach brought harsher nights, where frost-coated windows and the breath of villagers lingered in the air. In this environment, the candles became essential beyond ritual and comfort. Houses, shops, and workshops relied on steady illumination to continue functioning despite darkness and cold. Edric experimented with longer-burning wicks, denser wax mixtures, and careful layering to ensure durability. Yet he also preserved the hidden spaces within candles, knowing that the unseen figure might continue its silent oversight. or that villagers might rely on these secret channels to convey urgent messages. The interplay of utility, secrecy, and human behavior created a delicate and ever-changing dynamic. Edric's observations extended beyond the shop. He noted how villagers moved at night, how merchants left goods for neighbors, and how families adapted to scarcity. Each action became a piece of a larger pattern, a network of behavior subtly influenced by light, caution, and necessity. The Shadow's occasional interventions highlighted weaknesses, corrected oversights, or tested the efficacy of his work, and in response, Edric refined his approach. Together, without direct communication, they maintained a balance between freedom, security, and ethical responsibility, a quiet dialogue that shaped the life of the town with no recognition or fanfare. One particularly cold night, he noticed a trail of faint footprints leading to the river's edge. There, someone had carefully adjusted a hidden compartment in a stack of candles he had left for a merchant. The gesture was deliberate, precise, and almost ceremonial. Edric did not approach, but he took note. The figure was no longer probing in a random or intrusive manner. Instead, it was collaborating, ensuring the integrity of his craft, testing his foresight, and maintaining balance within the town. Each silent interaction reinforced lessons in patience, observation, and ethical engagement, illustrating the profound effects of quiet, indirect influence. The candlemaker also reflected on the practical and philosophical dimensions of his work. Every flame illuminated not only streets and homes, but choices and behaviors. Every hidden compartment conveyed trust, discretion, and a nuanced understanding of human needs. The silent dialogue with the shadow taught him that influence could exist without visibility, that guidance did not require acknowledgement, and that responsibility extended beyond immediate perception. In the quiet rhythm of night spent observing light, wax, and movement, Edric found a meditation on community, ethics, and the interplay of ordinary actions with unseen consequences. As the nights lengthened and the frost deepened, the interaction between Edric and the figure reached a subtle climax. The shadow's movements became more predictable, their interventions precise and measured. Edric adjusted his practice accordingly, crafting candles that not only served everyday needs but anticipated the town's patterns and responded to the unseen presence's tests. The dialogue was ongoing, yet it no longer carried tension or uncertainty. Instead, it represented a stable mutual understanding, a recognition that both craft and observation could sustain the community without confrontation or exposure. Yet, despite this understanding, questions remained unanswered. Who had the figure been? Why had it taken such interest in the candles and their hidden contents? Was it a messenger, a traveler, or someone invested in the moral and social order of Brindleford? Edric never sought answers, recognizing that the value of the interaction lay in its effect, not in the identity of its participant. The silent partnership had taught lessons in patience, ethics, and observation that extended far beyond wax, wicks, or flame. By the end of the season, Edric had refined not only his craft but his understanding of subtle influence. Candles burned longer, illuminated more effectively, and carried secrets safely. The shadowing figure, though rarely seen, had shaped his work and reinforced the principles of discretion, ethical responsibility, and observation. Brindleford continued its ordinary routines, unaware of the layered dialogues unfolding in the nights, yet thriving in part because of them. The silent forces of craft, vigilance, and moral consideration had ensured continuity and balance in a way far more profound than simple illumination could achieve. And so, as dawn approached after another long winter night, Edric paused in his shop, looking at rows of flickering candles, and reflected on the unseen lessons he had learned. The interplay of necessity, observation, and ethical restraint had left a subtle imprint on his work, his understanding of community, and the quiet order of Brindleford. In this delicate balance of wax, flame, and invisible influence, one is left to wonder, how often do the most enduring acts of guidance occur unseen, quietly shaping the lives of ordinary people, without acknowledgement, and how many of these forces are responsible for the rhythms of daily life that history rarely records. By the time spring returned to Brindleford, the nights had grown shorter, yet the lessons of the long winter lingered in Edric's mind and hands. The candlemaker's craft, refined through years of careful observation and patient adaptation, had become more than a trade. It had become a philosophy of subtle influence, ethical responsibility, and quiet vigilance. Each candle he prepared was a product not merely of wax and wick, but of reflection, foresight, and an understanding of human behavior shaped over countless nights. The shadowing figure, which had moved with deliberate care through the town for so many months, had grown increasingly rare. Its presence, once frequent and testing, was now almost ceremonial in its subtlety. Occasionally, a displaced bundle of wax or a rearranged supply would remind Edric that the dialogue continued, though the figure's exact movements and intentions remained a mystery. In this scarcity, he felt a sense of completeness rather than abandonment, recognizing that the lessons of vigilance, discretion, and observation had already been fully absorbed. The unseen influence had achieved its purpose without confrontation, explanation, or recognition. Edric continued to adjust his craft in response to both the town's needs and the patterns he had observed. Candles were placed with intention, longer-burning wicks in homes where families worked late, brighter illumination near streets where children played after dusk, and carefully hollowed compartments in certain candles for discreet communication. These actions, though seemingly ordinary, maintained continuity, guided behavior, and reinforced the subtle moral order that had come to define Brindleford's nightly life. The candle-maker's awareness, paired with the shadow's occasional interventions, ensured that ordinary tasks carried extraordinary significance. Through these experiences, Edric had come to understand that influence often occurs quietly and without acknowledgement. A candle's flame could guide a child safely home, convey a message across rooftops, or allow a merchant to complete a transaction after dark. The unseen figure had demonstrated that intervention could be subtle, precise, and ethically grounded, and Edric applied these lessons to his work and life. Every placement of wax, every length of wick, every hollowed compartment became part of a continuum of quiet guidance, a chain of small acts that shaped the community without fanfare or recognition. Winter eventually gave way to a gentle spring. The river thawed, buds appeared along the trees, and the village streets were illuminated by sunlight rather than candlelight. Edric's shop remained a cornerstone of Brindleford, not because of its size or renown, but because of the constancy, thoughtfulness, and care embedded in his work. The shadow's presence had become almost a memory, yet its influence persisted in the systems of observation, adjustment, and ethical consideration that Edric had internalized. Brindleford thrived, not through dramatic interventions, but through countless small, thoughtful actions that maintained trust, safety, and balance. Edric also reflected on the moral implications of secrecy and discretion. The hollow compartments he had once reserved for urgent messages and valuables were now symbolic, representing the intersection of trust, skill, and ethical responsibility. The lessons imparted by the silent figure reminded him that even ordinary objects, candles in this case, could carry profound meaning when handled with care and observation. The town itself had become a quiet laboratory for these principles, where ordinary lives were shaped by patience, attention, and subtle intervention. In this final phase, Edric understood that the true work of craft was inseparable from the work of observation and ethical engagement. Candles illuminated more than physical spaces. They guided choices, reinforced habits, and created the conditions for trust and stability within a community. The shadowing figure, though unseen and largely unacknowledged, had acted as a teacher, shaping Edric's understanding of patience, morality, and influence, without ever speaking a word. Together, they had preserved the quiet equilibrium of Brindleford, demonstrating that the most enduring effects often occur in the spaces between visibility and recognition. Even as the sun warmed the streets and the villagers moved freely under daylight, the memory of the nights lingered. Edric's craft, shaped by both necessity and silent collaboration, had become a testament to the power of careful observation, discreet intervention, and ethical decision-making. The candles themselves were ordinary, yet the work behind them, of anticipating need, shaping behavior, and guiding community life, was extraordinary in its subtlety. In the quiet flicker of flame, the invisible lessons of restraint, foresight, and moral responsibility persisted, quietly shaping the rhythm of life for those who depended upon it. And so, as Brindleford moved into the light of day, Edric paused to consider the lasting question that had accompanied him through countless nights. How many of the rhythms, safety measures, and ethical practices that sustain communities are guided by unseen hands, quiet observation, and deliberate restraint? And how often do we fail to recognize the invisible influences that preserve the ordinary order of our lives? In the windswept region of Northumbria, where rolling hills met dense forests and fog clung to the valleys like a persistent memory, there lived a cartographer named Oswin. Unlike the renowned mapmakers of royal courts, Oswin worked quietly in a small, stone-lined workshop at the edge of a village that few travelers ventured through. His maps were not created for fame or wealth, but for practical use, guiding villagers, traders, and the occasional wandering scholar through the treacherous paths that wound through hills, rivers, and forests. Each line, symbol, and notation represented hours of observation, careful measurement, and painstaking attention to detail. Oswin's life was one of methodical repetition. Day after day he would leave his workshop before dawn, accompanied by a small horse and a cart laden with parchment, compasses, ink, and charcoal. He would traverse muddy paths, measure distances with a rope or pacing, and make careful notes about landmarks, seasonal hazards, and the subtle changes in terrain. Every curve of a river, the height of a hill, the depth of a ford, or the location of a dense thicket mattered. One miscalculation could send travelers into dangerous swamps, mislead merchants, or leave families unable to reach neighboring villages during harsh weather. Though his work might seem tedious, it demanded acute observation and deep understanding of both the land and its people. Oswin learned not only the geography of Northumbria, but the rhythms of the villagers who lived along these routes. He noted when rivers swelled with snowmelt, when frost made early morning paths slippery, or when storms threatened isolated homes. He paid attention to the movements of animals as signs of hidden marshes or unstable ground. In every mapping expedition, he combined technical skill with an intimate understanding of nature's rhythms, creating documents that were both precise and practical, often saving lives in ways that no one realized. The maps themselves were simple to the casual observer: lines to indicate roads, tiny sketches of hills and rivers, and annotations in Oswin's careful hand. Yet each contained layers of information, accessible only to those who understood his subtle system of symbols. A mark indicating a shallow ford might also suggest safe crossing times during seasonal floods. A sketch of a grove could denote the presence of edible plants or medicinal herbs. Every symbol was multifunctional, encoding both geography and survival knowledge. Oswin's maps were living tools, refined over years, and adapted constantly to the changing landscape and weather patterns. Villagers often relied on his maps without fully understanding their depth. Merchants used them to transport goods, travelers followed them to avoid dangerous terrain, and families relied on them to reach neighboring towns safely. They trusted Oswin, not because of public acclaim, but because his work consistently allowed them to navigate Northumbria's wild and unpredictable environment. For Oswin, this trust carried responsibility. Each map was a promise to observe carefully, record accurately, and anticipate hazards before they became life-threatening. Yet, there was more to his craft than geography. Oswin noticed that the landscape itself could conceal dangers, not only in natural obstacles but in human behavior. Bandits, rival travelers, and opportunistic thieves often exploited isolated paths, dense forests, or marshy areas. Oswin began to include subtle warnings in his maps: shaded areas that indicated danger, minor deviations to avoid exposure, or faint lines that suggested safer alternatives. These warnings were not explicit. They were embedded within the symbols, readable only by those attentive to detail. In this way, the maps became guides not just through the physical landscape, but through the social and ethical landscape of risk and survival. Oswin's approach required patience, humility, and careful reflection. He spent hours by riversides, watching the current, or atop hills, noting wind patterns and the movement of clouds. He recorded subtle signs of erosion, animal tracks, and the resilience of vegetation to frost and drought. Each observation became a critical layer of knowledge, feeding into maps that would protect travelers long after he had returned to the safety of his workshop. Even minor details, the shape of a stone, the direction of a branch, the color of moss, could signal hazards or opportunities, and Oswin's meticulous attention ensured that such information was preserved for practical use. In addition to his cartographic skill, Oswin had a profound sense of timing. Roads that were safe in summer could become treacherous in winter. Certain forest paths became impassable during rain, and rivers shifted with seasonal flow. He incorporated this temporal knowledge into his maps, leaving notes for attentive readers about the conditions under which paths were safe. This made his work not only a visual guide, but a living document, responsive to environmental changes and attentive to human behavior. Despite the painstaking work, Oswin remained largely unknown beyond his village. He did not seek recognition. His satisfaction came from precision, observation, and the quiet knowledge that his maps saved lives. The villagers accepted his maps as tools, unaware of the depth of preparation, the hidden warnings, or the years of careful observation that went into each scroll. Yet for Oswin, the act of mapping was both practical and contemplative, a meditation on human interaction with the natural world, on foresight, and on the delicate balance between observation and action. And yet, even as Oswin meticulously recorded the rivers, hills, and hidden paths of Northumbria, he sensed that not all the world could be captured in ink. There were mysteries in the forests, dangers in the swamps, and human intentions that no map could predict. Every expedition raised new questions. How many travelers would heed his subtle warnings? How many dangers would be avoided? And how often did hidden hands, unseen by any cartographer, influence the course of events? The maps were a tool, but not a guarantee. Each journey taken with his guidance was a leap of trust, a negotiation between knowledge, observation, and chance. As Oswin returned to his workshop at dusk, ink-stained and weary, he often paused by the window to watch the dim light fall across the village streets. The paths he had mapped stretched beyond sight, winding through forests and over hills, carrying travelers who relied on his careful observation. Each shadow, each rustle of leaves, each distant sound reminded him that the land was alive and responsive, full of subtle dangers and quiet guidance. And in the back of his mind lingered a question, one that shaped the purpose of every map he made. How much of the safety, stability, and rhythm of life depended not only on his observation, but on the unseen forces moving through the world, influencing events in ways he could record, anticipate, or never fully understand. The winter months in Northumbria were harsh, and the winding paths Oswin had so carefully mapped became treacherous in ways that few travelers fully appreciated. Snow concealed ruts and shallow gullies, rivers swelled unpredictably, and sudden storms reduced visibility to almost nothing. It was during these months that the practical and philosophical dimensions of his work intertwined most deeply. Maps were no longer mere representations of terrain. They became instruments of survival, repositories of experience, and guides to understanding both the physical and social landscapes of the region. Oswin often traveled alone, accompanied only by the quiet creak of his cart and the occasional neigh of his horse. In these solitary journeys, he had time to contemplate the subtle interplay between the land and human behavior. Villagers, merchants, and even wandering scholars moved differently depending on the season, the weather, and the reliability of the paths he had marked. Some trusted his guidance implicitly, others relied on memory, intuition, or the wisdom of elders. In each case, the maps served as a silent mediator, translating the fluidity of nature into structured knowledge that could support decision-making and mitigate risk. Over time, Oswin began to notice patterns beyond topography. He observed how travelers adapted to hazards, how they avoided certain areas during storms, and how they responded to unfamiliar terrain. His maps became not only records of physical features, but repositories of behavioral insight. For example, a hidden marsh might deter cautious merchants while drawing the attention of opportunistic thieves. A steep hill, dangerous in winter, could serve as a shortcut in spring when the ground was stable. Oswin annotated these subtleties in his margins, often in codes that only a careful observer could interpret, creating a network of guidance that extended beyond geography into the realm of strategy and ethical decision-making. Yet his work was not without risk. Bandits sometimes lurked along less traveled paths, exploiting isolated stretches and the inexperience of travelers. One autumn evening, Oswin stumbled upon a makeshift camp where travelers had been robbed, the remnants of goods scattered in the mud. It was a stark reminder that maps, no matter how detailed, could only guide. They could not protect entirely from human malice or unforeseen accidents. The realization reinforced his commitment to embedding subtle warnings, alternative routes, and behavioral cues within his work, ensuring that knowledge conveyed not only locations but prudent strategies for navigating the uncertainties of life. During these months, the silent figure that Oswin had sometimes sensed in the background, footsteps in the night, faint marks near his workshop, or unusual disturbances along frequently traveled routes, became more apparent. This presence was careful, deliberate, and unobtrusive, never interfering but always observing. The figure seemed to study his methods, perhaps testing the map's accuracy, or perhaps learning from Oswin's approach to observation and risk assessment. Their interaction was indirect, mediated through trails left behind, subtle adjustments in materials, or the quiet acknowledgement of patterns. The dialogue, though wordless, shaped his practice, forcing him to refine details and consider contingencies he might otherwise have overlooked. The ethical dimension of his work continued to expand. Every notation on the map had consequences. A decision about a safer but longer route could save lives or delay trade. A hidden shortcut could be exploited for mischief or necessity. Oswin became increasingly aware that his responsibility extended beyond accuracy. It encompassed foresight, understanding, and subtle moral judgment. The unseen figure, through its careful observation and minor interventions, reinforced this awareness. Oswin realized that mastery of craft included not only technical skill but ethical discernment, patience, and the capacity to anticipate human behavior under diverse circumstances. One particularly bitter night, as snow whipped against the hills and ice crept along the river banks, Oswin found himself revising a map for a merchant traveling between two distant villages. The path crossed several steep hills and a wide river prone to sudden flooding. Recalling previous observations, he added annotations to indicate safer ford locations, suggested departure times to avoid treacherous conditions, and marked potential shelters along the route. He felt the presence of the shadowing figure nearby, a subtle awareness that someone else was attuned to his work. Though unspoken, the presence felt collaborative, a form of accountability that refined his practice and deepened his sense of responsibility. Beyond practical concerns, Oswin considered the philosophical lessons embedded in his craft. Mapping required patience, attentiveness, and an acceptance of uncertainty. The land could be measured and recorded, but it remained dynamic, shaped by seasons, weather, and human intervention. Similarly, travelers' responses to maps were variable and unpredictable. The role of the cartographer was not merely to document, but to anticipate, guide, and create structures that allowed for flexibility and adaptation. The presence of the shadowing figure underscored this mastery was not about control, but about collaboration, observation, and responsiveness. Through the long nights of winter, Oswin's maps became repositories of layered knowledge. Topography, behavior, hazard awareness, and ethical guidance were encoded into symbols and annotations that blended seamlessly with the practical needs of travelers. Each expedition, each revision, and each observation reinforced a network of guidance that extended beyond the inked parchment, shaping the rhythms, safety, and decisions of the village and its surrounding regions. The maps were living instruments, and Oswin, through meticulous attention and indirect collaboration, became a quiet steward of both land and people. And yet, despite the rigor of his work and the subtle collaboration with the unseen figure, a lingering question remained in Oswin's mind. How much of the safety, decision-making, and ethical navigation of his world depended on forces he could observe, and how much remained guided by unseen hands, human or otherwise, that shaped events in ways no map could fully capture. Spring finally returned to Northumbria, melting the snow that had blanketed the hills and revealing the rivers and valleys in crisp clarity. Oswin worked in his workshop with renewed purpose, examining the maps he had meticulously revised over the long winter months. Each line, each symbol, and each annotation represented more than geography. They were repositories of experience, insight, and careful judgment, reflecting both the physical landscape and the subtle human patterns that shaped it. The maps carried lessons in observation, foresight, and ethical navigation, ensuring that travelers could move safely through a world that was both beautiful and treacherous. The shadowing figure, which had appeared during the winter months, became increasingly elusive as the days grew longer. Its presence, once a frequent reminder of accountability and collaboration, had dwindled to occasional traces, slight disturbances along familiar paths or minor rearrangements in Oswin's materials. These reminders, though infrequent, continued to guide his practice, reinforcing the principles of careful observation, patience, and ethical responsibility. In a way, the figure had completed its purpose. Oswin had internalized the lessons, becoming a cartographer whose maps conveyed safety, insight, and ethical awareness to those who relied upon them. With the return of warmer weather, villagers and merchants resumed travel along the paths he had charted. Farmers carried goods to markets, travelers sought distant monasteries, and children explored the safer areas of the forest, all guided in some measure by the silent structure of his maps. Oswin observed from his workshop window, noting how people adjusted their movement based on the annotations, subtly shifting behavior and demonstrating the quiet power of informed guidance. His maps had become instruments not just of navigation, but of shaping the rhythm and safety of life in the region, all without overt authority or recognition. Oswin reflected on the nature of influence and responsibility. A single misplaced symbol or inaccurate measurement could have led to injury, delay, or misfortune. Likewise, careful attention to detail, the incorporation of hidden warnings, and the subtle guidance embedded in the maps saved lives and prevented hardship. The unseen figure had reinforced the importance of this responsibility, acting as a silent observer and indirect mentor. Oswin came to understand that true mastery of craft was inseparable from ethical awareness, careful judgment, and the humility to recognize forces beyond one's control. During one spring morning, as sunlight filtered through the workshop's small window, Oswin found a faint note, tucked beneath a corner of parchment. It contained no signature, merely a few words in a careful hand. Your diligence guides more than you see. Though brief, the message encapsulated the silent collaboration he had sensed all winter. It confirmed that his work had been observed, acknowledged, and respected, not through ceremony or reward, but through quiet recognition. The note reminded him that influence and guidance often operate subtly, beyond immediate perception, shaping outcomes and behaviors without fanfare. As he continued to refine his craft, Oswin began to train a few apprentices in the principles he had come to value most: careful observation, ethical guidance, and the integration of practical and behavioral insight into each map. He emphasized that accuracy alone was insufficient. A map must anticipate the changing conditions of both land and human activity. Apprentices learned to observe patterns in weather, animal behavior, and village life, understanding that the safety and cohesion of the community depended on subtle guidance and thoughtful attention. Oswin's legacy would extend beyond the inked parchment, instilling in future generations the same dedication to observation, ethics, and quiet stewardship. Through his years of practice, Oswin realized that much of life's safety and order relied on unseen influences. Bandits avoided paths because of subtle deterrents, travelers adjusted their behavior based on guidance embedded in the maps, and communities thrived because ordinary people acted with foresight and care. The shadowing figure had embodied this principle, showing that quiet vigilance, unobtrusive intervention, and ethical attention could achieve profound effects without acknowledgement. Oswin internalized this lesson, understanding that his maps were part of a larger network of guidance, influence, and responsibility, quietly shaping the rhythms of life across Northumbria. Even as the village resumed the rhythms of daily life, under spring sun and warmth, Oswin paused frequently to consider the larger picture. Each map was more than a tool. It was a subtle intervention in the flow of human activity, a guide to decision-making, and a repository of collective experience. The shadowing figure, though no longer present, had left an enduring impression that mastery of craft includes not only technical skill, but moral and observational acuity. The maps and the lessons they embodied would outlast the fleeting presence of any one observer, preserving guidance, safety, and ethical understanding for generations to come. The story of Oswin and the silent figure concludes without dramatic confrontation or revelation. There is no climactic encounter, no explicit recognition of heroism, and no singular moment of triumph. Instead, it leaves a lingering awareness of the quiet, cumulative influence of observation, careful guidance, and ethical responsibility. The maps continue to guide travelers, the village thrives in part due to unseen vigilance, and the lessons embedded in both craft and observation endure silently across the landscape. In the delicate lines and symbols of Oswin's work lies a subtle question: how many of the rhythms, decisions, and safety measures that sustain ordinary life depend on quiet, unseen hands, and how often do we fail to recognize the invisible networks that shape our everyday world?